in Manasavit. Michael is a graduate of the University of Connecticut School of Law, and over the past 25 years, his law firm has worked in all 50 states with many school districts, post-secondary institutions, and national organizations on issues related to federal support of education and workforce development. He's one of the nation's leading experts on federal grants management, audit resolution, and workforce education. We are pleased to have him come all the way to us today from Washington, D.C. to speak to us on the new federal uniform grant guidance, or otherwise known as UGG, Edgar and Perkins. In preparation for the meeting, we surveyed attendees that attended the Spring TACTI conference here in Austin, where Michael presented the pre-conference. And we asked attendees which topics they wanted more information and have tried to target some of those areas for today's presentation. Those of you that are listening to the webcast, if you have questions, you can send them to perkins@thecb.state.tx.us. And we will periodically or throughout the presentation address your questions and answers. So please help me welcome Michael Brustein.
Thank you, Donna, and good afternoon. Thank you, Elizabeth, for all your help in putting this together. I know a lot of folks are watching from the field that participated in the TACTI conference that we had in the spring, where we did cover a number of the issues related to the Uniform Grant Guidance, as Donna said, UGG, or the super circular, omni-circular, what have you. Interestingly, at that time, the U.S. Education Department had not provided implementing guidance on a number of provisions. Now they have. So for those of you that were attending that TACTI conference, I will be covering additional information that has just become available in the last few weeks. So I look forward to addressing that. And as Donna said, I'm here primarily as a resource to respond to questions. A number of colleges have already submitted questions. We have Don Perry from Dallas in the front row here, and he's already submitted some questions today. And I look forward to responding to all of those. The topic is Edgar and Perkins, and folks might say, well, really, what is the intersection between the Carl Perkins Career Technical Education Act and the Uniform Grant Guidance? So let me just tell a story about something that happened yesterday. I've been representing the Virgin Islands they're one of the territories, of course. They're always in trouble. They're a high-risk grantee. They have problems spending their monies lawfully. And they've asked me to come down to do a presentation next month on Perkins. So I said, and I communicated with them, I said, part of my presentation will cover the new regulations under Edgar. And they emailed me back and they said, No. We want you to cover the regulations under Perkins, not the regulations under Edgar. So I responded and I said, well, Perkins doesn't have any regulations. The regulations that govern the Perkins program are the Edgar regulations, the Education Department General Administrative Regulations. They cover all the costs and administrative rules that are applicable to Perkins. And they responded, well, we didn't know that. Those are the regulations for the Perkins program. It was some 21 years ago that the U.S. Education Department had rescinded all the program regulations that applied to Perkins, and now virtually all audits, monitoring, overviews of local school districts and colleges using Perkins funds really are based on violations or putative violations of the Education Department General Administrative Regulations. As of July 1, 2015, the Uniform Grant Guidance was formally adopted as Edgar, and those regulations govern the Perkins program. So what we're going to do today, and I assume the camera is going to be able to pick up and everyone will have a copy of this PowerPoint. We have a very ambitious agenda. I want to start really with what's going on with the Perkins reauthorization, just to bring you up to speed on that. Then I'm going to turn to the questions that Donna submitted to me, that the colleges have prepared. And then I'm going to actually move into the new EDGAR, starting really with a roadmap of Part 76. And everyone needs to know that Part 76 are the regulations that govern state-administered programs. Perkins is one of the 4 principal state-administered programs, along with Adult Education and Family Literacy, the Elementary Secondary Education Act, and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And by state-administered, it means that the compact is really between the Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, and the state eligible agency, the Texas Education Agency, which receives approximately $93 million a year in Perkins funds from July 1 to June 30. And about 30% of those funds are awarded from the Texas Education Agency, the state eligible agency, to the Higher Ed Coordinating Board. And those funds, at 30%, or approximately $30 million, those funds are awarded by a formula to the colleges tuning in today based on the Pell counts of students at those colleges. So the denominator would be all Pell students in the state at the colleges. The numerator would be the specific number of Pell students at each institution. That ratio or fraction is multiplied against that 30 million, essentially, to determine what each college receives. So there's specific regs dealing with Part 76, and then we'll move into the new Uniform Grant Guidance, which is Part 200, and deal with the major sets of controls: administrative costs, rules, financial management, allowability, procurement, inventory, monitoring, and audits. It is an ambitious agenda, I realize that, but again, my primary focus is going to be responding to your questions. So everyone who's tuned in understands that we are operating now under the Perkins 4, the Carl D. Perkins Act number 4, and we're waiting for number 5. This act, number 4, was authorized by Congress in 2006. Texas submitted a transition plan for 2007, and then Texas submitted a 5-year plan for 2008 through 2012. And the question is, well, what's happened since then? Now we're in 2015. The Perkins program has not gone away, even though the authorization expiration in 2012 has occurred. There is a provision in a separate act called the General Education Provisions Act, or GEPA, which provides that if Congress fails to reauthorize these state-administered programs on a timely basis, the act will be continued automatically and allow for Congress to appropriate funds each year. And that is essentially what's happened over the last 3 years. It's called the contingent extension of programs for 2013, 14, 15, and the fiscal year that we just entered, July 1, 15 to June 30, 16, same process. So the question is, when are we going to be operating under Perkins 5? Where does Perkins stand in the pipeline? And on that, there have been some rather interesting developments. Obviously, the number one priority of the current Congress is to reauthorize the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, or No Child Left Behind. And everyone knows that there are certain provisions in that statute which are directly relevant to the Perkins statute dealing with accountability, particularly at the secondary level. The House 2 weeks ago passed its version of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which was immediately followed by the Senate passing its version. And the question is, before Congress now, can they come together with a conference substitute that the president is willing to sign into law? And that is a real big if. The president has made it very clear that if the House bill landed on his desk, it would be vetoed. The Senate bill, the president has said he can live with most of the provisions. The Senate bill is a bipartisan bill. It had 81 senators voting in favor, 17 against. It's so rare. It is so rare these days to have anything that's bipartisan in Congress. So to have a bipartisan rewrite in the Senate with Democrats and Republicans joining in is a rare occurrence. However, the next step in this process is to try to reach some compromise with the House, and no one is really betting the ranch that the House is going to essentially accede to what the Senate wants to do. The House bill significantly reduces the federal footprint in federal education. It eliminates many of the accountability provisions, the teacher evaluation provisions, the continuous improvement, adequate yearly progress, all of the sanctions, the waiver authority. It's a significant pullback from what we have now under No Child Left Behind. So the reason why that's important is that the Senate indicated that if ESEA is reauthorized, they're going to move next to the Higher Education Act reauthorization and then Perkins. The House has indicated that once ESEA is out of the way, they're going to move to Perkins reauthorization. Well, there's only so much staff on the House and Senate Education Committees, and they are right now doing a side-by-side, the House version, the Senate version, current provisions, and trying at the staff level to reach agreement. The House and Senate go on summer break next week. They return after Labor Day, and obviously the number one agenda after Labor Day is coming up with appropriations. So the best case scenario, the very best case scenario, is that maybe, just maybe, they'll get done with the ESEA reauthorization this year. I doubt that they're going to be able to find time before they break to deal with the Higher Education Act, and I highly doubt that they're going to deal this calendar year with the Perkins reauthorization. So I think the real issue here is, where do we go? And I think for planning purposes, the best way of looking at this is say that Perkins will likely be authorized in calendar year 2016, likely with a start date for July 1, 2017, at which time a new state plan, new local plans would be due under the new legislation. Just going along with the PowerPoint, I put this note in. Remember the bipartisan effort on the Workforce Innovation Opportunities Act last year. No one last June of 2014, predicted that Congress would be able to move forward on the stalled Workforce Investment Act of 1998, but they did. So is there a chance that Perkins could be reauthorized? I think there's a chance, very, very remote. I think folks should plan on it happening in calendar year 2016. So what will it look like? Congress will not take the approach to Perkins as Congress is taking to the Higher Education Act and the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And by that, I mean the Elementary Secondary Education Act will be a significant rewrite of current law. That will not happen with Perkins. Why? Because most folks, and Democrats and Republicans on the Hill, they're pretty satisfied with what Perkins provides right now. It does provide significant flexibility to the field to essentially accomplish what they want, to expand on career tech education. So I don't see turning this legislation on its head. I see rather that the legislation can be primarily tinkering with it. And there will be, I believe, a much closer alliance with the Workforce Innovation Opportunities Act. And I think that the Department of Labor will likely have a more active role with regard to career tech at the post-secondary level. And I'll save some comments for that for a few moments when I get to the Workforce Innovation Opportunities Act. The administration, the Obama administration, has pushed certain initiatives with regard to Perkins reauthorization. By and large, they're going nowhere. The Obama folks wanted to eliminate the funding formula that has existed for many years, since 1963, and the Federal Vocational Education Act has been around since 1963, had provisions that required the states to distribute the vocational funds on a formula reflecting economic need. The administration has said there's a better way of doing it, to drop the formula approach and adopting a competitive approach. In other words, having the colleges in Texas compete against each other to run innovative programs with the Perkins funds. That is not getting any support in Washington, D.C. among Democrats or Republicans. So that's not going to happen. The administration has also proposed eliminating the separate silos between secondary and post-secondary for career tech, and rather having the approach that we used to follow with both Tech Prep, the Tech Prep Education Act, and the School to Work Opportunities Act, of having one application submitted on behalf of secondary and post-secondary. That is not getting much support either, and I don't think that Congress is going to seriously consider it. Some states, Louisiana, Minnesota, Oregon, have moved in the direction of having colleges work much more closely with their secondary partners in submitting annual plans to the state. But I think that there's a flexibility under the statute to do it. It will not be mandated. The administration has suggested expanding the partnership beyond secondary and post-secondary partners to include business and industry. However, they add the caveat that for business and industry to be at the table as an active partner, business and industry should be required to submit a match, either a cash or in-kind contribution of a match. And that clearly is not going anywhere. So you can see the trend here is that each change that the administration has provided has really not gotten support on Capitol Hill. They have talked about taking potentially up to $200 million off the $1.1 billion that's appropriated for innovation projects that each state would run, not out of the federal office, but each state would run. And there is a possibility that Congress might be somewhat receptive to having an innovative fund. I think that that is still being considered. The last element there on programs of study. Programs of study was a new term introduced in Perkins 4, requiring articulation between secondary and post-secondary, resulting in a credential, an associate's degree at the end. But this current statute requires that there be just one program of study at each college, at each school district in the state. I think we will see expansion upon that in the law. A number of organizations, national advocacy organizations, have promoted a greater focus on programs of study. So on funding, Texas received its award on July 1, 2015. That was essentially identical to the amount that Texas received on July 1, 2014, meaning that the colleges will, for this year, will be getting essentially the same amount that they received last year. I think there's a question in terms of what the colleges will receive for the period July 1, 16 due to sequestration. Sequestration is going to be around to the year 2022, seeking significant cuts year in and year out. And my best guess now is, even though the House and Senate have indicated that they would like to have flat funding for Perkins for the period beginning July 1, 16, I'm afraid that there will not be an appropriations bill. We have not had an appropriations bill for the last 15 years. We've had essentially omnibus bills or continuing resolutions. A continuing resolution, essentially the same amount of funding from the prior year. Or an omnibus bill is that they simply are unable to reach agreement on funding levels, and at the last minute they pull together the funding from all agencies. They call it an omnibus. Last year, they did not have an omnibus. They did not have a continuing resolution. They had a new term called a chromnibus, which was a combination of a continuing resolution, CR, and an omnibus. All agencies were put essentially on the omnibus except for Homeland Security. They were funded on a short-term continuing resolution in response to the president's immigration policy. But again, I would suggest that we prepare perhaps for a 1% cut for the period beginning on July 1, 16. Now, before I move to the WIOA, I started out saying that there were no regulations, program regulations, under the Perkins Act. That is true. However, on April 24th, 2015, the federal office, called the Office of Career Tech and Adult Education, under its acting assistant secretary, Johan Uven, issued Guidance 4.0 under Perkins. And you've got to love the irony of this, that this is the first guidance issued under Perkins 4. It did not happen when the law was enacted in 2006. It did not happen in 2007, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, or 14. They waited to the spring of 2015, where we're on the precipice of having brand new legislation to issue the initial guidance, the first guidance under the Perkins Act. And I suggest that the colleges that are tuned in, please go on the OCTAE website, www.ed.gov/OCTAE, and you will find the 4.0 guidance. It deals with a number of issues, one in particular that has become much more relevant in recent monitoring by the federal office is on the requirement in the Perkins statute for sufficient size, scope, and quality to be effective. For those that are relatively new to the Perkins enterprise, the one section of the statute that you need to be familiar with is Section 135. 135 is divided up into 4 parts. Part A says that when the colleges receive Perkins funds, they shall, mandatory, use the funds to improve the career tech program. And that means not maintain, but to actually improve, new, revised. Section B of Section 135 lists 9 mandatory elements that the colleges must follow. And one of those is that everything that is funded with Perkins funds must support activities that are of sufficient size, scope, and quality to be effective. And now when the federal office goes out and monitors state agencies, colleges, and school districts, one of the first things that they're looking at is how can you defend that what you are funding at the college level is of sufficient size, scope, and quality to be effective. And now in this guidance, they're saying that states and colleges should have written protocols on defining what constitutes sufficient size, scope, and quality. Obviously, a one-time activity is not going to meet that requirement of funding. A keyboarding program for all students obviously would not meet that requirement. They just did a significant monitoring review in Alaska, it being a very rural state, And they said, we just question how these funds are being used. How does it relate to the overall program of study? How does it relate to the improvement of performance indicators under the various accountability provisions of Perkins? So I would ask that folks take the time to look. It's a multi-page document setting out a number of fiscal provisions dealing with supplanting career tech student organizations, purchases of equipment, memberships in professional organizations. It's worthwhile taking a look at this. It was issued on April 24th, 2015, and it is on their website. Now, Workforce Innovation Opportunities Act. I just wanted to spend a couple moments mentioning that because I have been getting queries from a number of states since the Department of Labor issued a notice of proposed rulemaking on April 16th. On April 16th, the Department of Labor issued 4 sets of regulations coming close to maybe 500 pages of regulatory analysis on this statute. But I believe the most controversial aspect, and one that every college that's listening in has got to be attentive to, deals with the issue of using Perkins funds to support one-stop infrastructure costs. And let me give you a little bit of background on that, because every college listening has got to decide. You receive each year an award from the coordinating board. Now you're going to have to decide how much of that award needs to essentially be transferred to the local workforce investment board to support local infrastructure costs. And infrastructure costs are non-personnel costs at the one stop. So a little bit of background on that. The Workforce Investment Act, enacted in 1998, had a provision in Section 134, which in paraphrasing, it provided that each federal one-stop partner program, in which Perkins is one, Adult Ed is one, but each federal one-stop partner program was required, it's a mandate, was required to contribute a proportionate share of its federal program, being the Perkins Act or the Adult Education Family Literacy Act, to help support the establishment of the one-stop centers around the state and to support core services or informational services to the folks that go into these one-stop centers. It was a mandate. Interestingly, very few of the 19 federal programs, and there are 19 federal programs of which Perkins is just one, which are considered one-stop partner programs. Very few actually contributed to the operation of the one-stops between 1998 and 2014. So Congress needed to address that failure, that deficiency. And they did so in the enactment of the new law, the Workforce Innovation Opportunities Act, which was signed into law virtually exactly 1 year ago by President Obama. And that law set out 2 options, Option A and Option B. Option A provides that the one-stop partner program, that is, the colleges, would voluntarily sit down with the local workforce investment board and enter into a memorandum of understanding, an MOU, to decide how much either Perkins funds in cash or in-kind contributions should be made to the operation of the local workforce investment board. Essentially a continuation of Section 134 of the 98 bill. However, there is now an option B, which provides that if any of the one-stop partners, that is essentially the colleges, fail to voluntarily enter into this MOU, then option B is triggered, whereby the governor of the state would determine a proportionate amount of the funds available under each one-stop program funding, which is reserved for state administration. And this is where it gets tricky, and please pay heed. It says that the governor can take up to 1.5% of the Perkins state admin dollars and distribute those to the local workforce investment boards to support the one-stop operation. Now, as I said, Texas receives about $93 million, and 5% of that would be maybe 4.8 million. And 1.5% of the whole would probably be around 1.3, if my math is right, about 1.3 or 1.4 million. So essentially it says the governor could take about 1.3 or 1.4 million of the state admin funds under Perkins that go to the coordinating board, detouring the coordinating board and allocating those to the local workforce investment boards. Now, as I'm saying this, I'm sure it does not provide a comfort level to Donna or to others in this room that view that there's significance to the limited state admin dollars that you get. But if you, the way it's divided at 30%, governor can basically take up to 1.5. That could wipe out the entire amount that the coordinating board receives. So would the decision essentially rests with the governor, but to use those funds if the colleges do not voluntarily enter into these MOUs. So this is the issue. I don't think we have any college presidents listening in, but if they did, the college presidents would ask, or at least ponder the following issue. Okay, the statute says, A, I voluntarily enter into a memorandum of understanding with the local WIB, and the dollars come out of my pocket. Or two, there's been bad blood between my college and the local WIB for a number of years, and I'm not going to give them a dime, because if I don't give them a dime, then it comes out of Donna's pocket. What are they going to do? What are they going to do? Well, I'm not answering that question, but that is an issue that I'm being asked by a number of states right now, saying, wait a minute, some of these presidents would much prefer the money's coming out of the state's pocket than coming out of their own pocket. And that is the way Congress essentially developed the statute. This is going to go into effect on July 1, 2016. This new support of local infrastructure costs. So stay tuned. We're going to be hearing a lot more about this particular point. Okay, next are questions that have been asked from the colleges. And there's a whole variety of areas here, and I want to spend some time. And my hope is that most everyone listening has got a copy of the new Edgar, because I'm going to be making references. If you're listening in and you do not have a copy of the new Edgar, then my advice would be just to record to just record or note the statutory regulatory citations that I give you to refer to different provisions. So here in the next slide, these are some of the questions, and I've got additional ones and others may be coming in this afternoon. But 1 through 9, I want to go through each of these, beginning with equipment purchases, inventory, disposition, micro purchases, new procurement, and so forth. These changes went into effect 28 days ago. They absolutely are going to impact the awards that you've received for fiscal year 2016. And for those of you that have a copy of the new Edgar, I think that many of you do, I'm going to be referring to page 126, page 127, 200.313. Again, the regulations on using Perkins funds to purchase equipment and supplies has changed. And these changes that I'm going to walk you through are applicable to all federal grant funds that your college receives. Not only Perkins, not only Adult Ed Family Literacy, but your WIOA funds, your Gear Up, TRIO, Upward Bound, whatever federal grants from whatever, there are 28 agencies, federal agencies involved. These are the rules that apply. So on page 127, the changes really begin on the left-hand side at the bottom under paragraph C, use. And essentially it sets out a number of options. So let's hypothecate that you, in the last few years, submitted an application to the coordinating board to use your Perkins funds to purchase equipment for, let's say, a nursing program, a health program. And you no longer need that piece of equipment for the CTE instruction that you're maintaining. What are your options? Well, your options now are different from what you had before. And so it says here at the bottom 127, left column, when no longer needed for the original program or project, the equipment may be used in other activities supported by the awarding agency in the following order. And they set up two priorities here. One, they said if you no longer need it for the Perkins program, you can use it first for any other activity that your college is running that is supported now or in the past with funding from the U.S. Education Department. You look around, there are none. Then it lists priority number 2, activities supported by other federal agencies. So you may be operating a trade adjustment assistance activity at the college or WIA activity at the college. It says you can just simply move the equipment to that activity. Obviously, you can dispose of the equipment, but first it gives you an option that you did not have before, just simply moving it to other activities unrelated to the Perkins program. But if you look at the bottom of the middle column of page 127, item number 4, this is brand new. It says, when acquiring replacement equipment, the non-federal entity, that is the college, may use the equipment to be replaced as a trade-in or sell the property and use the proceeds to offset the cost of the replacement equipment. This is significant flexibility that we have never had before. So for the first time, effective July 1, 2015, the colleges, 3 years ago, they purchased an expensive piece of equipment for the nursing program. Let's say you spent $150,000. You want to upgrade the technology. There's a fair market value right now for that piece of equipment at $50,000. In the past, you would have been required to sell it, dispose of it, take the $50,000, return it to the coordinating board would return it to Washington. Now we have flexibility which says you don't have to do that. You do not have to do that. It says when acquiring the replacement equipment, you can use it as a credit, a trade-in. So if it has now a value of $50,000 that either you get by selling it on the open market or back to the vendor, that is your money to use towards an upgrade or really any other equipment for that program. And that is a significant change. Significant change. Or you go ahead and you dispose of it. And if it has a fair market value exceeding $5,000, then you return those funds to the state. So let me just recap. You've purchased equipment with Perkins funds. There's three avenues. Avenue one, you no longer need it for the Perkins program. You can allow other activities to use it if they're supported by federal funds. Two, you trade it in, and whatever credit is generated, that belongs to the college and goes to the purchase of the new equipment. Or Avenue 3, you go ahead and you simply dispose of it. And if you do, if it has a fair market value exceeding $5,000, you've got to remit that back to the coordinating board called the pass-through agency, which sends it back to Washington. That is when you no longer need it. But let's say you do need it, you're still using that piece of equipment, but during the day, the regular school day at the colleges, that equipment sits idle for a certain percentage of time, say half the day, a third of the day. Then you look middle column at number 2, and you've got changes in the roles there. During the time that the equipment is used on the CTE program for which it was acquired, the non-federal entity, the college, must, mandatory, also make the equipment available for use on other projects or programs currently or previously supported by the federal government, provided such use will not interfere with the primary use. So you've used Perkins funds to set up a lab, a computer lab. For a third of the day, it's sitting idle. It says now you must put that equipment into use for other activities. And here it sets up 3 different priorities. Priority 1 is, it says, activities supported by the U.S. Education Department. 2, priority 2, there are none. Then activities supported by other federal agencies. There are none. Then you go to priority 3, which is any other activity, whether or not funded by the federal government, which would simply say to the college, if you are buying equipment, you need to develop a new culture of making sure that the equipment simply does not sit idle during periods of the day. If you set up a computer lab and you're running adult literacy at night, you should definitely make the equipment available for that use. Those are changes. Any questions on that among folks in this room? Yes, Donna.
In the example you gave about the nursing equipment, what if you sell it and you don't need something for that exact program, but you need it? That allowable?
I think that if it is... Yes, I'm going to repeat each question. So the question is, you've purchased the equipment, say the nursing equipment, with Perkins funds. You no longer need it for that. You want to upgrade. Or can you go ahead and sell the equipment and then use the proceeds from that sale for any other activity. And the regulation says to offset the cost of the replacement property. I would believe, because Perkins requires continuous improvement, that if the proceeds are being used to support CTE activities, it would never be questioned by the auditors. If you used it for something unrelated to CTE, such as general education, I think it would definitely be questioned. So I think it's got to go towards the CTE program. Don.
Michael, in terms of this, making sure that this equipment gets used for the course of a regular day, well, colleges often don't have regular day schedules. I mean, they have periods of time when classes are scheduled more often mornings, then kind of a separate grouping in the afternoon, a separate grouping of time at night. We don't have to necessarily demonstrate usage on a 24-hour basis.
Not at all. Not at all. And I think there would be great deference to what the college defines as its regular day, instructional day. Great deference. Elizabeth, any questions coming from the field on the equipment?
Well, the two that came in, they answered them as you kept talking.
Okay, thanks, Elizabeth. All right, then with regard to management procedures, if you would turn to the right-hand column on page 127, and all, again, colleges, please note that these requirements apply to all federal grants for all federal agencies. It says property records must be maintained that include a description of the property, a serial number or other identification number, the source of funding, the acquisition date, the cost of the property, the percentage of federal participation in the project, the location, use and condition of the property, and any ultimate disposition data. So those are all mandates for, those are the controls at a minimum that the colleges have to use when using any federal grant funds to purchase any equipment. A physical inventory must be taken at least once every 2 years. A control system must be developed to ensure adequate safeguards to prevent loss, damage, or theft. Any loss, damage, or theft must be investigated. Please note what it does not say. It does not say that if you have a computer lab and 3 computers are stolen, you have to replace those computers. It doesn't say that. It says you must investigate it so that when you're monitored by the state or the federal government or audited, you have controls or records that show that the theft was investigated, with the outcome of trying to put in place better safeguards to prevent this theft or loss in the future. Adequate maintenance procedures to keep the property in good condition, and then disposition data. Obviously, you can sell it at any time, but you've got to show that if it was sold, what was the amount that was generated from the disposition. If it's over $5,000, then you would have to remit back to the coordinating board. Okay, on micro purchases, that is an issue that does not really come under equipment, but comes under procurement. And the regulation that governs that is on page 131 of the Education Department General Administrative Regulations, 200.320. And this section sets out 5 different methods of procurement in which a micro purchase is one. And it basically says that procurement by micro purchase is the acquisition of supplies or services. The aggregate dollar amount does not exceed the micro purchase threshold, which is $3,000. To the extent practical, the non-federal entity must distribute micro purchases equitably among qualified suppliers. That means if you have $9,000 left in the grant award, you don't go to Staples with three $3,000 purchases. You spread it around to different stores, different vendors. Micro purchases may be awarded without soliciting competitive quotations if the college considers the price to be reasonable. By reasonable, you can simply go online to Amazon.com. That's basically a standard that would be used for reasonableness. I don't think that if you can document that type of diligence, it would ever be questioned. But keep in mind that the Uniform Grant Guidance are general administrative rules, and this is a state-administered program. Can the state of Texas, can your individual college have more restrictive rules? And the answer is absolutely. In any instance in which the state has more restrictive or the college has more restrictive rules than these, then the college must always follow the more restrictive rules. So, for example, if the college says that in order to avoid bidding, the threshold can only be up to $1,500 or $2,000, that would be more restrictive. That would certainly be allowable. If the college said, no, you don't have to do any bidding if it's under $5,000, well, that would clearly be in violation of this federal rule. So with federal funds, it says $3,000. Anything over $3,000 would be a small purchase, which would require at least 2 bids. So a college cannot say, well, okay, we're using federal grant funds. We understand that the federal threshold is $3,000. We're going to up it to $5,000. No, you can't do that. You can lower it and make it more restrictive, but you cannot exceed it. Any questions on that?
Michael, I did get one question.
Sure.
They were asking on what you were talking about earlier in regards to tracking. It says, what is the year requirement for tracking?
The year requirement for tracking under the management requirements. Okay, so in terms of tracking, it's the issue essentially is record retention. So let me give the exact requirement for record retention. Page 137, 200.333. Financial records, supporting documents, statistical records, and all other non-federal entity records pertinent to the award must be retained for a period of 3 years from the date of the submission of the final expenditure report. So, Elizabeth, you give out the grant awards on what date? On September 1? When?
That's when they go in.
From September 1 to August 31, correct? So today's date is July 28th. Let's say that Austin Community College today, on July 28th, 2015, entered into a contract to purchase computers using Perkins funds. This regulation in 200.333 provides, for purposes of tracking, you would have to have controls in place to show that from the period of the submission of the final expenditure report, if it goes through August 31, Elizabeth, you asked for expenditure report 60 or 90 days later? 60 to the end of October. Would be November 1?
Right, but all expenditures must be processed by August 31st.
Right, but the date of the final expenditure report would essentially be November 1. Purchased today, the expenditure reports are submitted and final by November 1, 2015. According to this regulation, it said you have to retain these records for a period of 3 years. Now, my recommendation, obviously, because there's a 5-year statute of limitations from the U.S. Education Department governing the Perkins program, that the U.S. Education Department, the auditors, the coordinating board could actually go after the college for 5 years from the date that the computers were obligated to July 28th, 2020. So if auditors came to Austin Community College on July 29th, 2020, and they said, well, show us how you've tracked in your inventory the computers that you purchased on July 28th, 2015, the inquiry would stop right there because more than 5 years had elapsed. More than 5 years had elapsed. They would say, well, we do not think that you have an effective tracking system, but the fact of the matter is there's no recourse for the federal government to go after beyond that 5-year statute of limitation period. And colleges, please take heed that that 5-year statute of limitations does not apply to any grant funds that your college receives under the Higher Education Act. Not for student financial aid, not for TRIO, Upward Bound, Student Services, Gear Up. Under all federal grant funds received under the Higher Education Act, the U.S. Education Department has no statute of limitations. Indeed, they have gone after colleges 9, 10, 11 years after the obligations have been made. But with regard to Perkins, there is a 5-year statute of limitations. Question, Don.
Yes. Currently, we're being asked annually by the coordinating board to provide a cumulative list of capital equipment that we've purchased, and that's an ongoing list. So it's like regardless of how many years ago.
Right.
It's just a cumulative list of the equipment that we still have in inventory.
So the question is, I guess the question is, what do you do in that situation where you've got a 5-year statute of limitations, but the pass-through agency requires you to maintain a cumulative list of everything that has been purchased? And I would respond really in the following way. And I made reference to this a little bit earlier. Perkins is a state-administered program. Under a state-administered program, the compact is between the Secretary of Education in Washington and the state government. The state government is permitted, authorized, to go ahead and impose additional responsibilities, criteria, policies that are more restrictive than what the federal government wants. So if you're asking me, does the state have authority to do that? Absolutely, the state has authority to do that. Would the college ever be responsible for returning those funds if something was unaccounted for more than 5 years from the date of obligation? The answer is no. You would never be required to return those funds to Washington. I do have a caveat to that, and that's on page 136 of Edgar. The regulatory site is 200.331A3, in which it says any additional requirements that the pass-through imposes on the college in order for the pass-through to meet its own responsibilities must be communicated to the college. In other words, you can't say to the college, where is your cumulative record of capital equipment, unless it is clearly communicated each year in the grant award. In other words, the courts would say, unless conditions are clearly communicated to the recipient, you would not be bound by them under this regulation. It must be communicated to the college under this. This is a brand new regulation that needs to be taken into account. Next question was on travel. Some significant changes with regard to travel. It's on page 176 of Edgar. The actual regulation is 200.474. Now, please note that on this issue of travel, it is under Subpart E of the Uniform Grant Guidance. Subpart E are the cost principles. There's 55 cost principles in alphabetical order, in which travel is just one of them. No. It says travel costs are for the expenses for transportation, lodging, subsistence, and so forth for the official business of the college. Such costs may be charged on an actual cost basis, on a per diem, mileage, or any combination of the two. And then it goes on to say, in accordance with the college's written travel reimbursement policy. So every college must have a written travel policy. It is one of six written policies and procedures that are mandated by the Uniform Grant Guidance that went into effect 28 days ago. And I'm going to repeat these throughout the afternoon. But travel is one. Procurement is two. Cash management is three. Allowability of costs is four. Conflicts of interest is five. And gratuity violations is six. In other words, there's 6 times in these regulations, the new EDGAR regulations, where it says that the college must maintain written policies and procedures. Again, travel, procurement standards, allowability of costs, cash management, conflicts of interest, and gratuity violations. With regard to travel, it says lodging and subsistence in paragraph B, the costs incurred by employees and officers of travel, including cost of lodging, subsistence, incidental expenses, may be charged to the grant, in accord with the written travel policies of the college. And then it goes on, it says, in addition, this is brand new, in addition, if these costs are charged directly to the award, the Perkins Grant, you must have one, participation of the individual is necessary to the award, meaning that when the monitors, auditors review the records of how Perkins funds were used by the college, and they see that personnel from the college used Perkins Grant funds to travel, say to my conference in December in New Orleans, they would have to show that a supervisor signed a statement that this benefits the program or this is necessary to the program. Simply some documentation that a supervisor said this would be an allowable charge against the Perkins Grant. That is new. We've never had that requirement before. Paragraph C talks about temporary dependent care costs above and beyond regular dependent care may also be charged. First time, so as of 28 days ago, under the new grant award that we received for Perkins and all other federal grants, if an individual attends a professional development workshop or conference, or goes on travel status for their college, and they incur excess child care costs, say normally they pay $150 a week, but they're going to be away for 3 days, they're going to pay $250 a week. That excess cost of $100 may, permissive, be charged against the Perkins Grant. That is allowable for the first time. It's an allowable charge against the Perkins Grant. Do the colleges have to do that? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And for those colleges that do not have written travel policies, you would be required to follow the policies of the General Services Administration in Washington, D.C., which are very restrictive. I urge all colleges to come up with their own written policies. Next item, indirect costs. A lot can be said. We could probably have a workshop on that. But I want to combine that with the question that was asked by Don. And the question is this, that the coordinating board follows the federal statute for allowing institutions to designate up to 5% of direct costs for administrative costs and to use either the allocation method or an indirect method based on a federally approved indirect cost plan. Is there a difference in terms of institutional use of these funds based on the method used? Does one or both permit the institution to treat these funds as institutional funds? And if so, can these funds be carried forward by the institution from year to year, or must unspent Perkins administrative funds be returned to the coordinating board? And to respond to these questions, let me just back up and explain the difference between direct costs and indirect costs. And I think perhaps the best way of doing that is to look at exactly what the regulations provide. So on page 146, Regulation 200.413 sets out the information on direct charging to grants. The next page, 147, 200.414, talks about indirect costs. Colleges for many years were familiar with what was called F&A costs, facilities and administration. The new Uniform Grant Guidance no longer follows that. They simply use the term indirect costs. As a general principle, and please, I hope, Elizabeth, the questions come in to the extent that people are confused by that. There is no accountability for costs that are recovered by the colleges under an approved indirect cost rate. Let me repeat that. There is no accountability for the funds that the college recovers under an approved indirect cost rate. So, for example, if a college is receiving a TRIO grant or an Upward Bound grant, the Department of Health and Human Services in Washington, actually the Dallas Regional Office for HHS, comes into your college and they negotiate with you an indirect rate. And it would not be inconceivable that indirect rate could be 30, 35%. So that means if you, let's just say you get a TRIO grant for $1 million over a 12-month period. Each time the college draws funds from that $1 million during a 12-month period, let's just say they draw $100,000 and they have an approved rate of 35%, then 35% or $35,000 is being recovered by the college to reimburse the college for costs the college is generating to support this federal activity. That $35,000 belongs to the college. There's no accountability for that $35,000. Don could take that $35,000 and go to a casino. There's simply no accountability for it. You've earned it once that rate has been negotiated. So the question is, in terms of carrying monies forward or not, since you've earned it and there's no accountability, there's certainly no requirement to return that because that is the college's money. It is simply reimbursing the college for costs that the college has generated to support that federal activity. That's point one. Point two. Let's understand, what is the difference between a direct cost and an indirect cost? A direct cost is a cost that you can identify the cost with precision. That if you're paying a salary, if you're buying a computer, if you're going to a professional development activity, and you know the precise cost, that should be charged directly against the grant. However, there are lots of costs that the college incurs that it would take a very long period of time to figure out exactly what the benefit to the Perkins program is. So, for example, colleges are running data offices, accountability assessment offices. They may have an HR office. They may have a legal office, where these activities are benefiting a multitude of federal grants on the college. How do you know how much of that HR, legal, budget, data function is supporting the Perkins CTE program? It'll take a long time to come up with that answer. And that's the definition of indirect. When it is difficult to identify the exact benefit, then you use an indirect approach to come up with essentially a fiction based on data that the college had as to what types of costs the college is putting forth itself to benefit these federal activities. So that's the difference between direct and indirect. Now, the Perkins statute, and I mentioned Section 135 is the most important provision, has 4 paragraphs to it, but paragraph D of Section 135 says that the colleges may use up to 5% of the award to support administrative costs. So college receives $200,000 from the coordinating board for a 12-month period. Then 5% or $10,000 would be available for administrative costs. The federal government views administrative costs and indirect costs synonymously. They do not make a distinction, really, between administrative and indirect. So here, this is where it begins to get a little bit tricky, and on Don's question. The indirect rate that the federal government, through the Dallas office of the Department of Health and Human Services, sets is for programs and grants that the colleges receive that do not have a non-supplant provision, such as the programs under the Higher Education Act, TRIO, Upward Bound, Gear Up, or Trade Adjustment Assistance, or WIA. They do not have non-supplant provisions, and again, typically that indirect rate could be 30 or 35%. That rate that is set by the federal government, Department of Health and Human Services, has no relevance, in my opinion, to the Perkins program, which is 1, state administered, and 2, has a non-supplant provision. The key to this is the non-supplant provision. Because when you have a program that has a non-supplant provision, which says that the federal funds must supplement, not supplant, the position of the federal government is there are so many functions at your college that are going to occur anyway, whether or not you participated in the Perkins program. You're going to have an office of the president. You're going to have an office for these deans. You're going to have a general counsel's office and so forth. You're going to have these various offices whether or not you participate in the Perkins program. So the rate that is set for indirect for programs that have a non-supplant provision is not 30 or 35%. It's typically 2, 3, and sometimes 4%. And it's not the responsibility of the federal government to set those rates. It's a responsibility, and it's said very clearly here in the Uniform Grant Guidance. I'll give you the citation for that, of going back to the responsibility of the pass-through. Back to page 136, 200.331, requirements for pass-through agencies, pass-through entities. If you look in the right-hand column, Roman numeral 13, it says the pass-through has a responsibility for setting the indirect cost rate for state-administered programs. So the rate that is set by the federal government, really, those rates have no relevance. Can the state come up with a default of 8%, and that 8% is certainly allowed? It says the coordinating board can simply say, okay, we are just going to give you a default rate of 8% as our negotiated indirect cost rate. However, where the statute has a cap of 5%, as Perkins does, in no instance can you exceed that 5%. So let's say Dallas Community College receives $100,000, has an 8% rate approved by the state, which would be, say, $8,000. The statute says no more than 5%, which is $5,000. Bottom line is the max that the college can charge for admin is the $5,000. If the college wants to use the indirect approach and has an approved rate of 8% and it's capped at 5%, those dollars belong to the college, Don. They belong to the college. There's no requirement to pay it back. The only requirement to pay it back is when the college uses a direct charging, where they say we're going to direct charge the $5,000, and they only have records that they can support $3,500, then that $1,500 would, at the end of the year, go back to the state. But where there's an approved rate, the college has earned that, and going forward, those are the college's dollars, no accountability to do whatever they'd like. Elizabeth, any questions on that? I know it's pretty confusing. Go ahead, Don.
I will, as a follow-up on that, certainly the large institutions like Dallas, many of us do have these federal indirect rates. A lot of the smaller institutions don't meet those requirements, right. And so the coordinating board allowed those, or any of us, to, rather than have that indirect rate, we could use what's been called the allocation method,
right,
which was an alternative way to allow the institutions to document what their administrative expenses are.
Well, under an allocation method, the way the feds would view that is just, again, let's use a hypothetical. Let's say that the administrative costs of the college are $100,000, and CT Career Tech represents that 30% of the students at the college are CTE. Under the cost allocation method, you could argue that 30% of the administrative costs benefit the CTE program. If you're asking the state do that and set up a cost allocation methodology, I think the answer is absolutely yes. They can. But again, you're always subject to the statutory cap. You can never exceed the statutory cap.
But bottom line is, regardless of whether it's the allocation method or the indirect method, whether it's following federal agencies, we under Perkins, we're limited to no more up to that 5%.
That's right.
Direct. And so if we don't
well, 5%, not 5% of direct. You're limited to 5% of the award. Whatever part of that 5% of the award is attributable to indirect, you have absolutely earned that with no accountability.
Wait a minute. Wait a minute. Because up to this point, the way it's been interpreted here in Texas is that our administration must always be tied to how much of our direct that we spend. So if we don't spend all of our direct, we don't get all of our 5%.
No, the statute reads up to 5% of the award. You really raised a very interesting question. Is it 5%? Let's just say the award's $100,000. 5% is $5,000. But let's just say that the college only spends during the 12-month period $50,000. Are they allowed to use the $5,000 or the $2,500, which would be 5%? And believe it or not, the Office of Career Tech and Adult Ed, in resolving audits, has ruled both ways. In some instances, they said, no, you're allowed the full 5%. In other instances, they've said you are only allowed 5% to what you've expended. I've taken a case on behalf of Wyoming to the U.S. Court of Appeals on that, and in that, which only affects that jurisdiction, which does not include Texas, the court said in that case, it's 5% of what you expend. It's not 5% of the award. But I'm not going to stand here and say that is the policy of the federal government. They've had it both ways. They've had it both ways. A footnote to these questions on indirect and admin is a new wrinkle in terms of charging for administrative and clerical salaries. That is in 200.413 on page 146. Brand new rule. Again, 200.413. Paragraph C. It says the salaries of administrative and clerical staff should normally be treated as an indirect cost. And that is going to be a rude awakening to a lot of colleges watching this presentation today, because I submit that most colleges have direct charged to their grants, Perkins or otherwise, administrative and clerical staff as a direct charge, not as indirect. And the regulations changed 28 days ago. It says that now to direct charge any administrative or clerical costs against a particular grant, the Perkins grant, you have to meet 4 conditions. That administrative or clerical services are integral to the Perkins program. The individuals involved can be specifically identified with the project. The costs are explicitly included in the budget. And so what this means, and again, my recommendation is that a lot of colleges want to continue the practice of direct charging administrative and clerical salaries. You can do that. So on your next grant awards, even though this went into effect on July 1, 2015, because you're not getting the award until September 1, when you submit your budget for the period beginning September 1, 2015, if you are going to direct charge salary of administrative or clerical staff, you identify that person by their position description. That, in other words, the position description will say Don Perry, Dallas Community College, 50% of his time is on Perkins admin. That's in his position description. Then you take that information and you put it into your proposed budget that you submit to Donna. And you say in the budget that we're going to use Perkins funds to pay 50% of Don Perry's salary, administrative salary, which is directed to the Perkins program. And then it's approved by the coordinating board. Those would be the only circumstances which would allow the direct charging for administrative or clerical staff going forward. So let me repeat that. If you, beginning on the next cycle on September 1, please, if you're going to direct charge administrative salaries, put the percent of the administrative effort for that employee into the position description, and then transpose that information into the budget and get that budget specifically approved. Otherwise, there will be audit exposure to pay those monies back, because it should have been picked up now under the indirect. Next issue, time and effort. I guess that's a good segue into time and effort. So the regulations on time and effort are set forth beginning on page 152 of the Edgar at 200.430. And I think it's important to emphasize that one of the overarching reasons that the federal government decided to completely rewrite all of these federal circulars, consolidated into one, was all the confusion that was being generated by audits for time and effort. So typically, the federal auditors from the Inspector General's office would pick a college, say in Texas. They would go in, and what would they do? They would look at the budget. They would look at the budget that the college adopted, in which the college says, okay, in its budget, we're going to pay the salaries of 8 employees with Perkins funds. And for those 8 employees, in some instances, it would be 50%, some instances might be 75%. And then they look at the time and effort certifications, the reporting that the college, that the employees were submitting. And by and large, the monthly reports, the biweekly reports reflected exactly what the percentage breakdowns were in the approved budget. And as soon as the auditors saw that, they disallowed all the expenditures for that, because they said, you are paying your folks based on the way you budgeted them. You're not paying them based on how they actually worked at the college. So there were just millions and millions of dollars of audit exceptions. And now they've re-examined that approach, which had been in place for about 40 years, and they've thrown it out. And they've come up with new standards. And I want to share with you what those standards are. So on page 152, at the beginning, it says that, no question, that federal funds can be used to pay salaries of individuals working on programs that benefit the program. So whether it's deans, counselors, coordinators, instructors, administrators, whether it's students who are working to support the program, or part-time, full-time, yes, it is allowable to use Perkins funds to pay salaries. Under any grant, really, unless the grant indicates otherwise. And I don't know of any, there's 750 federal programs, I don't know of any federal program that does not allow federal funds to be used to pay salaries. By and large, that is the largest expenditure of federal grant funds every single year. So the issue is not can they do it, absolutely the colleges can. The question is how. And it's always been how. How do you do it? And in accord with 20430A3, it says you can compensate them as long as you have a system which satisfies the standards described in paragraph I. So you got to go to paragraph I, which is on page 154. It's in the middle column. In the middle. And paragraph I said standards for documentation. Charges to federal awards for salaries must, mandatory, be based on records that accurately reflect the work performed. So that's the first standard. That, yes, you can use the Perkins funds to pay salaries, but you must have a system of records. Those records must accurately reflect what the employee is working on. These records must, 1, be supported by a system of internal control which provides a reasonable assurance that the charges are accurate, allowable, and properly allocated. Now that's the key right there. That the college must adopt a system of controls that provides a reasonable assurance that the charges for salaries are accurate. And that is a very slippery slope. When a lawyer looks at a sentence that in one part says reasonable and another part says accurate, it can be confusing. Because to me, reasonable is close, but not 100%. Accurate is accurate. So it says a reasonable assurance that your charges are accurate. And it goes on to say that are incorporated into the records of the college and reasonably reflect the total activity for which the employee is compensated. That third element, reasonably reflect 100% of your time, is very important. Why? Because for 40 years, the standard had 4 elements. One, it said the certification had to be after the fact. In other words, for the past 2 weeks, this is what I did. So element number 1, it always had to be after the fact. Element number 2, it had to be signed by the employee. Element number 3, it had to be at least monthly. And element number 4, it had to reflect 100% of what the employee did. So if an employee of a college might have a particular professional workload and then is assigned additional responsibilities, that is not 100% plus the additional responsibilities. 100% is 100%. You can't work 110%. It's 100%. So if you're assigned additional responsibilities, that becomes part of the 100%. But the key here is that under the new regulations, only one of the 4 elements is retained, 100%. You've got to have a system of controls where employees provide some record or documentation of what they did 100% of the time. It no longer says it's got to be after the fact. It no longer says it's got to be signed by the employee. It no longer says it's got to be monthly. You could do it quarterly, by semester, anything that you deem to be reasonable. So the issue, I think, that colleges need to face on these new regulations is, well, it took us a lot of years to get where we are now. Do we throw out the system that has taken a lot of years to develop? Or do we stick with the system that we have in place, which seems to be working? That's a decision that the colleges will need to make. My opinion is that if you had a time and effort system in place which met the old law, you can absolutely rely on that to meet the requirements of the new law, because the new law provides much greater flexibility. Again, it simply says, have a system of records which provides a reasonable assurance that the charges are accurate. Gives you a lot of flexibility as to how to design that. Do you have to throw out the old system? No. If the old system was compliant, then it's clearly compliant under the new law. Elizabeth, any questions from the field on time and effort?
No, one question that did come in was asking if the HR needed to have a policy and procedure in place for time and efforts, because they recall mentioning about like when they're getting audited.
Great question. So the question is, should colleges have a written time and effort system in place? And I would respond to that by saying, A, it is not required by the Uniform Grant Guidance or EDGAR, but 2, it makes a lot of good sense to do that. And the issue is this. We've been doing these national forums. Our firm has been doing these national forums for 20 years. And we typically always invite the Office of the Inspector General. At one of our Vegas conferences, we had the auditors from the Inspector General's office out of Dallas come. And they were quite entertaining, but what they provided us the following story. They said, we go into a college in Texas, and we do the entrance conference, and we ask them for their written policies and procedures as to how they manage federal grants. And they say one of three things happens. One, the college knows we're going to ask for it, and they have it right there, and they can give it to us. And they said, when that happens, we are in and we are out, and we all feel better about it. Two, they say, oh, I think I know where those written policies and procedures are, and they go to an office, and they come back 15 minutes later from a document that was written in 1995 that's filled with dust, and they say, this is worthless because obviously you're not training your employees on these policies and procedures. Or three, they just drop the hearing and say, oh, we're supposed to have policies and procedures as to how we manage our federal grants. I mean, we don't need to reinvent the wheel here. There are colleges that have terrific sets of policies and procedures in the state of Texas and all over the United States. We were just up. We did a visit with Columbus State Community College in Columbus, Ohio. I was blown away by what a great set of policies and procedures that they have. It's online. You can check that out, Columbus State Community College. Valencia Community College, Seminole Community College in Florida, great examples of, from soup to nuts, every issue that can come up under federal grants are covered. It's just so much wiser and more prudent to have these policies and procedures in place. Okay, which takes us right to the next item, internal controls, policy requirements, record keeping. Internal controls are those written policies and procedures that protect the integrity of the federal assets. And as I mentioned, there are 6 sets of required policies and procedures that you have. I'm going to continue to go through them this afternoon. When auditors and monitors visit and they find that you do not have these in place, then obviously the colleges will be written up. But the name of the game is having these controls in place for each of the major features for costs and administrative rules. Meetings and meals. Okay, now that is an issue that has come up really recently with the U.S. Education Department, and it's covered first in general under the topic of conferences on page 158. The regulatory site is 200.432. And again, please distinguish between travel and the regulations on conferences. If you are an employee of a college and you are on travel status, all of your reasonable costs for subsistence may be reimbursed with Perkins funds. The more restrictive rules come into play where your college is the host or the sponsor of a meeting or a conference. That's where things get really tricky. Not if you are attending a conference. If you come to my conference in Washington or New Orleans, these rules do not apply. But to me, I'm certainly not a non-federal entity. I'm a vendor. And if you travel to New Orleans or Las Vegas, you're an employee of your college, your meals can be charged against that federal grant. It's when you sponsor it. And so it says, a conference is defined as a meeting, retreat, seminar, symposium, workshop, whose primary purpose is the dissemination of technical information. And obviously, if folks today, Don drove in from Dallas to Austin, this is a meeting where technical information is being disseminated. His costs as an employee of Dallas Community College can be directly paid for by the college. But what about the host of this conference? What about Donna? Well, I look around, and for those of you that are not in the room, Donna is serving water. I assume it came from the water fountain. There's no food here. So we're making a record of this. There's no food, there's no meal. But what if I came in this afternoon and there was this great spread of bagels, lox, cream cheese, and so forth? The question is, can the cost to Donna as the host of this meeting for food be charged to the Perkins grant? And what the regulation says in 200.432, it says allowable conference costs paid by the non-federal entity, the coordinating board, as a sponsor or host may include the cost of meals. May include the cost of meals when you're sponsoring. That's a general rule. Unless restricted by the terms and conditions of the award. And that is exactly what has happened here. The Texas Education Agency, the Texas Coordinating Board, on July 1-15 and on July 1-14, received from the Office of Career Technical and Adult Education in D.C., again, a grant award notice, which had an appendix to it, Appendix J. And Appendix J contained guidance on using federal grant funds to pay for meals, which further restrict the general rules here in Edgar. And for those of you that have our book, those requirements are set out beginning on page 279. 279 of the book. It sets out very specifically the only conditions in which federal Perkins funds or any federal education grant funds, please listen, federal education grant funds, this rule does not apply to labor, does not apply to the National Science Foundation. So those colleges that are listening in that have NSF grants, that have grants from the Department of Defense or from the Department of Labor, this appendix dealing with the restriction on education grant funds does not apply. It only applies to monies coming to the colleges either directly from the U.S. Education Department or through a state-administered program such as Perkins through the coordinating board. And it says that, well, there doesn't seem to be any authority for using grant funds if you're sponsoring a meeting to pay for a breakfast or to pay for a dinner. Paying for a lunch would be permissible if it is truly a working lunch where you need to bring folks to that meeting in and out in the same day, and that during the lunch period you are actually carrying out the substantive agenda. You're not networking, you don't have a motivational speaker, an inspirational speaker, you're working through the agenda. That would be the only allowable scenario to charge federal Perkins or other federal education grant funds to pay for the cost of meals. Now, there may be folks out there that say, oh, you know, under the Higher Education Act grant, under our TRIO program, we've been paying for meals. If the grant instrument itself authorizes the use of funds to pay for food, that's fine. But you're not going to find that anywhere with regard to Perkins. And again, this requirement only applies to the sponsor, the host of the conference, if that host or sponsor is a non-federal entity. It certainly doesn't apply to private firms such as myself. Okay, financial management is the next element there, and those regulations are set out, and we're going to jump back here. Those regulations are set out on page 118. And under financial management, obviously, the federal government only wants to do business with entities, non-federal entities, that have sound financial management systems. And if I could just digress on that for a moment. 2 weeks ago, the Office of Post-Secondary Education in the U.S. Education Department released a list of 400 post-secondary entities in the United States that are on what's called heightened cash management. Heightened cash management, which is a risk designation, a higher risk designation, because of a variety of factors. One, an audit report was late, student verification was faulty, program reviews were done out of the Dallas regional office and found systems to be lacking. I looked on that list in Texas. They seem almost invariably to be for-profit, proprietary organizations here in the state of Texas. Other states, by the way, I was amazed, for example, in the state of Alabama, which listed a number of the state technical colleges being on heightened cash management. But again, the feds only want to do business with colleges that have sound financial management practices in place. And there are 7 elements to financial management set out on page 118, right-hand column. Most of these 7 are essentially a repetition of pre-existing requirements, but with a few variations. Let me just quickly run through them. 1, the college must have an identification system to be able to identify all federal awards that it receives. It's got to identify it by Code of Federal Domestic Assistance number, year, federal awarding agency, and so forth. Very straightforward. Colleges have always had that responsibility. 2, now this is an interesting twist, and a twist from the information that I provided at the TACD conference last spring. 2 says that the college must maintain accurate, current, and complete disclosure of the financial results of each federal award in accordance with the new requirements under 200.328. And when I was at TACD in the spring, I talked about that regulation. It's the new requirement for performance metrics. And under 328, it says that each non-federal entity will annually report to the state and the state back to the federal government on whether the college met the objectives set out in its application. That if the college said we were going to provide credentials to 200 welders, you're going to have to answer to that. Did you actually provide the credentials to 200 welders or 200 people completing the nursing program? And it said that the forms would be provided by OMB. So there's been somewhat of a twist to this that I want to share with you, and I want to back up here for a minute. When the Uniform Grant Guidance was published on December 19th, 2014, that regulation contained the administrative and cost rules for 28 agencies. For 28 agencies, over which the U.S. Education Department was just one. And if you would take the time to go back to the Federal Register of December 19th, and you were to look at what the 27 other agencies did, you would quickly observe that the 27 of 28 federal agencies and departments did what they were supposed to do. What were they supposed to do? Well, OMB, the year before, on December 26, 2013, directed each agency by June 26 of 2014 to come up with its own set of administrative and cost roles and explain the exceptions or modifications that that agency would have to these general administrative and cost roles. Indeed, 27 of the 28 agencies did that. One agency took the lazy route. That happened to be Arne Duncan in the U.S. Education Department. And you could submit a whole cast of reasons as to why that happened. But if you look at the regulations for the Department of Labor, they go on page after page explaining how the Department of Labor administrative rules deviate from the Uniform Grant Guidance, as did HHS and Defense and the National Science Foundation, all 27. Until you get to the rules for the U.S. Education Department, which was 2 pages in length and had 2 ridiculously insignificant modifications having nothing to do with the administration of programs. One saying that the U.S. Education Department wants to continue to use the term high risk, even though it's not in the Uniform Grant Guidance, having no meaning other than what's in these regulations. And 2, that Arne Duncan does not have the authority to delegate responsibilities to anybody outside the U.S. Education Department, particularly at OMB. Nothing really of relevance. So here we were, Ed just taking a silent posture, and then finally, late this spring, realizing, wow, all these rules are coming into force on July 1, 2015. There seems to be a lot of confusion in the field, and they didn't really know that there was confusion in the field until different organizations. We serve as counsel to a group called the Association of Education Federal Financial Administrators, and we're exchanging emails in which we copy the U.S. Education Department. They go, oh, wow, there's a lot of confusion as to a number of significant elements, including the performance metrics of 328 under financial management. So the U.S. Education Department in April gets on the phone and he says, we will set up a system where if folks want to write to us and ask us questions, we will respond. This is in April, a year later than they should have done it. So our firm started submitting questions. Some states were just reluctant, but we submitted on behalf of some states. But one of the questions that I wrote to the U.S. Education Department was, how is the U.S. Education Department going to interpret 328 requiring all the colleges to submit performance metrics as part of their reporting mandate? And 3 weeks ago, I got a response. Now, I want to tell everyone here that the best place to go and to see all the guidance that the Education Department has put out in the last several weeks on the Uniform Grant Guidance is our website, www.brewman.com. We are compiling every response that the Education Department is putting out on the Uniform Grant Guidance, www.brewman.com. On this question, performance metrics, interesting, they responded in the following way. They said, we believe that current U.S. Education Department programs satisfy the performance metrics requirements through the existing statutory requirements on accountability. Bottom line is, we're not going to add anything else in terms of what OMB has asked for, because we think what is already called for under the Perkins statute, under the Adult Education Family Literacy Act, special ed, elementary and secondary, satisfies that. Now, that is their current position. That might change when they're reprimanded by OMB, saying, no, you don't understand. We want uniform performance metrics for the entire country for all federal grants. But right now, the published response is colleges do not need to do anything else to meet the requirements under 200.328 on performance metrics. Stay tuned, but that's where we stand. That's where we stand right now. 3, going on to page 119. Colleges must maintain records that identify the source and application of funds. This would include source documentation. If you're given $100,000 in Perkins funds, you must have source documentation to show how that full $100,000 is obligated. Don, of course, if you got an approved indirect cost rate, that would satisfy that percent for what's being charged to indirect. 4, effective control over and accountability for all funds, property, and other assets. The non-federal entity must adequately safeguard all assets and assure that they're used solely for authorized purposes. This is the most important part of financial management. It says you have to have controls in place to safeguard all assets. The federal government defines equipment as assets with a fair market value exceeding $5,000. This is much more specific. Any technological items that the college purchases with federal grant funds, whether it's $50 for a digital camera, an iPod, an iPad, anything that's technological in nature, you must have controls in place, and I urge colleges to go ahead and put a tracking number on that. If it's a technological item, put a tracking number on it. Because the bottom line is when the colleges are audited and monitored, and you say, well, this was under our capitalization threshold, you will be cited under the regulation 200-302-B4, that you did not have adequate safeguards in place to protect the assets that you purchased with federal Perkins dollars. 5, a comparison of expenditures with budget amounts for each federal award. This is going to require that even though your budget is approved for the period beginning September 1, during the next 12-month period, you periodically reconcile your expenditures to make sure that they are in accord with your approved budget. 6, written procedures on cash management. This is brand new. Remember I said there's 6 sets of written procedures. One of them is on cash management. Here, the colleges are reimbursed with Perkins funds. That is, you incur the obligation, you expense it, you pay the vendor, and then you provide that documentation to the state. The state reimburses you. If you are on a pure policy of reimbursement, meaning that the college pays out of its own pocket first and then it's reimbursed, you're never going to be in a situation of having to generate interest. But if you receive Perkins funds in any which way before they are expensed, that is paid electronically to your vendors, to your employees, whether or not the funds are placed in an interest-bearing account, the college will have an interest liability which will need to be paid back. And the new rule on that, it was $250. It's now moved to $500. It's not $500 for the Perkins program. It's $500 in the aggregate for all federal programs, grants that you run. So to the extent that the college generates any interest or receives money from the state or federal government, receives federal grant funds prior to those dollars being expensed to vendors, interest will be accrued. Any amount exceeding $500 in the aggregate would need to be returned to the coordinating board to be returned to Washington, D.C. 7, the last item here under financial management, written procedures for determining the allowability of costs. In other words, another set of written policies and procedures. How does the college determine what is allowable under a federal award? What is the organizational process? What is the process that you go through in putting the budget together and determining that what's going to be charged under the Perkins grant? You're not required to have written policies and procedures on allowability for the Perkins program. It's a set of written policies and procedures to cover all grants. They don't simply want a restatement of subpart E of the Uniform Grant Guidance. They want to know, how does the college make the decision in terms of what should go into the budget? How do you know what safeguards are in place to make sure that these funds can be charged against a particular grant award? So those are the 7 elements of financial management. It's 3 o'clock. Donna, I'm going to turn the mic off for about a 15-minute period, and we'll pick up at 3:15. Elizabeth, we may have more questions coming in. Okay? Thanks. Okay, we're going to pick up where we left off. Hope we haven't lost too many folks out there in the field, haven't put you to sleep yet. I do again want to make reference, because it came up during the break, to this issue of these forums. To those of you that are relatively new to the federal grants management and the enterprise, please consider coming to our forum. I've made references to that, and a number of folks from the various Texas colleges. We always get great representation from the Texas colleges at our forums, both in Washington, D.C. and our fall forum. Our fall forum this year is December 2, 3, and 4. It's 3 days of this. It's rather intensive. It's in New Orleans at the beautiful Roosevelt Waldorf Astoria Hotel. New Orleans is a great town in December. The weather's terrific. And we have some top officials from the Office of the Inspector General of the U.S. Education Department, from the Office of the Secretary, Arnie Duncan, and from a number of other offices within the U.S. Education Department that will be speaking there. But we're dealing with fraud, we're dealing with grants management, we're dealing with the new Uniform Grant Guidance and the recent guidance coming out of the U.S. Education Department. If you're interested, you want to get more information, again, just go to our website, www.bruman.com. Also, Elizabeth has indicated that she has identified the guidance from the Office of Career Tech and Adult Ed 4.0, and that anyone that wants a copy of that guidance, please just email Elizabeth and she will forward it. Again, that is the guidance that the federal government has given out on Perkins 4, 9 years late, but they've given out guidance on Perkins 4. And you can.
Sure, Don. I would be happy to do that.
So Don has asked Elizabeth to send it to the Perkins contacts, and that's exactly what Elizabeth will do. So on this slide that we're still on, the ninth element is advertising, marketing versus giveaway items. And again, it is part of the cost principles. And if you go over again to Part E, and you go to advertising, I think it's going to be the first item listed. It is on page 150. The site is 200.421, advertising and public relations. And the information here in 200.421 basically is unambiguous. It says federal grant funds cannot be used to advertise or promote the institution. That Don Perry cannot use Perkins funds to promote Dallas Community College. However, Don can use Perkins funds to go on radio, TV, newspaper, any other medium to do outreach or to provide information on the features of the federal grant. So Perkins funds can absolutely be used, that if the college is going to provide a new program in robotics using Perkins funds, that the college can use grant funds to put that into the newspaper and radio, saying that there's going to be this new offering on this activity. Again, not to promote the college, but to promote the features of the federal program. One of the subparts of this regulation, on page 151, it says, in the left-hand column, number 3 at the bottom, costs of promotional items and memorabilia, including models, gifts, souvenirs, is unallowable. So you certainly cannot use Perkins funds to pay for gifts, jackets, model souvenirs of any nature. If you're sponsoring a conference and you want to give away these black bags with your logo on it, that's fine. Just don't charge it to the federal grant. That would be an unallowable expenditure. Okay, some more questions have come in from the field. One dealing with time and effort. It says, if staff is 100% funded through Perkins and they are exempt, and they're then asked to teach a semester, does that have to be calculated in the 100%? Does time and effort have to recalculate with the grant? 100% is 100%. If you are 100% dedicated to Perkins and then the college says you have an additional load of teaching a particular course, 100% is the work you were doing with Perkins and then adding into that the additional instructional period. That becomes 100%. There's no way to do the math other than that. It's not 110% or 100% plus X, Y, and Z. 100% is everything, X, Y, and Z. It's everything that you are being compensated for. If you have a set salary and then you're given an additional responsibility and you receive a stipend for that responsibility, then 100% is what you were making plus the stipend that you're receiving for that additional responsibility. That is required. It's the only element that's carried forward is that you've got to certify and report based on 100%. Okay, next question asks for some clarification on 7 elements of financial management. The best way of responding to that is simply going to the regulation, and I went through each element. There, but again, that is what you need to do. It's giving you the citation once more. We're going back to page 118, 200.302, financial management. There are 7 elements. They're mandatory elements. I'm not going to read through them again, but they're set out there in the regulation. Which takes us to the beginning, the structure of Edgar. And I have no apologies. It's much more important to spend the time focusing on the questions that were asked. And Elizabeth, please interrupt me as additional questions come in from the field. Now, on the structure of Edgar, let me just give a little bit of background on this. That the U.S. Education Department went into being in 1980. It is just about the youngest of all federal agencies. It's only 35 years old. Prior to that was the U.S. Office of Education. Under the U.S. Office of Education, they had the responsibility, it was then part of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. Originally, they did not have one uniform set of administrative regulations. Each program had its own set of regulations. It wasn't until 1973 that a decision was made. Let's have one set of general administrative regulations that applied to all federal education grants. And thus was born in 1973 EDGAR, and I was actually one of the architects of the original EDGAR. Those regulations have stayed in place since 1973 until July of 2015. And actually, for the colleges that have received TRIO grants or any direct grant post December 26, 2014, the regs went into effect for any direct assistance received from a federal agency after December 26, 2014. So this is really the first major rewrite of these administrative regs going back over 40 years. And it may be another 40 years before we have another rewrite. Why did the Office of Management and Budget undertake this? I think it was part of regulatory reduction. It was a real need to have one set of rules applied to all federal organisms, all non-federal entities. In the past, colleges are subject to one set of rules, nonprofits another set of rules, K-12, local school districts a different set of rules. One set of rules for administrative requirements, one set of rules for audit, one set of rules for costs. All of these circulars made it very difficult for lawyers to know which set of rules to apply. So for the coordinating board was a state agency. The coordinating board was subject to the same rules as local school districts. But the colleges that the coordinating board serves was subject to the rules for post-secondary institutions. The coordinating board was not subject to the rules on post-secondary institutions because the coordinating board is a state governmental entity, not a post-secondary institution. This made things real confusing. So the decision was made 3 years ago saying we've got to have one set of rules that applies to everyone. And they first called it the Super Circular, then they called it the Omni Circular, and now they call it the Uniform Grant Guidance. And then the U.S. Education Department formally adopted that and put that into the Education Department General Administrative Regulations. EDGAR is part of Title 34. 34 is the number assigned to all education programs. So the colleges that are participating in student financial aid, they all are with Pell Grants. The regulations are all in Title 34. The titles are divided up into parts. And the parts are Part 75 for direct grant programs. Those are the regulations that apply where you receive the monies directly from the U.S. Education Department under the Higher Education Act, such as Student Services or TRIO. Part 76, as I mentioned, are the regulations that apply to state-administered programs such as Perkins and adult education. Part 77 are Education Department definitions. Part 81, enforcement regulations. When there are audits, monitoring, where there's a question of exposure for the colleges, all the provisions dealing with enforcement are in Part 81. And then now an integral part of EDGAR is Title II. Title II applies to every federal agency. It's 2 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 200. I cannot overstate the significance of that citation in the sense that every college that's participating in this session needs to know that probably for the next 40 years, every document that you receive for any grant from any federal agency is going to reference 2 CFR Part 200. You're going to see that over and over again, so you might as well get used to it. 2 CFR Part 200. And if I could just tell a story that Don has heard probably too many times about a nonprofit that was set up by the Mayor and Chamber of Commerce here in Austin, Texas, a number of years ago under the School to Work Opportunities Act. The School to Work Opportunities Act was career tech, administered Unfortunately, Congress said it's going to be administered by two agencies, the Department of Labor and Department of Education. And it was set up back in 1994. And then the mayor of Austin and the Chamber of Commerce in Austin, Texas, said, let's go after these monies. And they created a 501c3 nonprofit foundation. And that foundation applied for two grants, one from Ed and one from Labor, each for $1 million. And they received both $1 million awards exactly on the same day. And so they hired an executive director to this foundation who came out of the private sector. He worked for Dell Computer. He had no experience working with federal grants. And on his first day on the job, he was given two letters, one from Ed, one from Labor, and asked to sign both. And they contained all sorts of assurances with regulatory sites, and it said OMB Circular A87 in terms of what could be charged, to these federal grants. Sign both. They spend $1 million at Labor to spend $1 million at Ed, and a year later, he gets a letter, he gets a phone call from the Dallas Regional Office of the Inspector General saying, we're coming to do an audit of your two school-to-work grants. And the gentleman says, well, what are you going to audit us on? And the gentleman from the Inspector General's office says, we're going to audit you on your compliance with OMB Circular A87. What does he say? He says, what's OMB? And that started and ended it right there. He didn't even know that OMB stood for the Office of Management and Budget. Clearly, he wasn't paying attention to the circulars or regulations issued by OMB, which is essentially now 2 CFR Part 200. The auditors came in, they said, well, which dollars were used to benefit the Ed grant? Which dollars were used to benefit the Labor grant? And they had no system of controls or records to show which benefited which. So the Inspector General said, well, pay the $2 million back. Just pay the $2 million back. So you don't want to get into that mess when now for the next 40 years, the colleges sign assurances, we're going to comply with 2 CFR Part 200. And you're saying, well, what's 2 CFR Part 200? It is the Uniform Grant Guidance, which is formally part of the EDGAR regulations. Effective dates, again, the key date is December 26, 2014 for direct grants from a federal agency, and then July 1 for state-administered programs, but because I think there are 2 states in the United States that do not use the July 1 to June 30 12-month period. Alabama, which goes from October 1 to September 30 on their grants, and Texas, which goes from September 1 to August 31. Now, I don't know what the wisdom is of not using July 1 to June 30, because Texas receives the billions of dollars of funds when you add it all up on July 1. The year goes from July 1 to June 30, but I think historically you've always used September 1 to August 31. I guess you'll continue to use that, even though you're sitting on the authority to draw those funds 60 days earlier, but Texas has not taken advantage of that. Let me back up here. Two important points. One, on procurement. So the group that wrote these new regulations was called COFAR, the Council on Financial Assistance Reform. Who was COFAR? COFAR was a group of staffers from the 10 lead agency for federal grants from the various CFOs, Chief Financial Officers' offices, that worked for 3 years in pulling this together. And what was their mission? Their mission was, going forward, we're going to have one set of rules. Should that set of rules be based on what the rules were for post-secondary, on what the rules were for nonprofits, or what the rules were for state and local governments? Or something totally new. So for time and effort, they came up with something totally new. But in most other instances, they said, well, we're going to go with this rule or we're going to go with that rule. So when it came to procurement, when it came to the question on procurement, they said, we are going to adopt essentially the rules that have been in place for state and local governments. And we recognize that colleges are going to have to adapt to these new procurement rules, which are much more onerous than the old rules that they had under procurement. No surprise, the colleges screamed bloody murder, and OMB said, okay, we're going to back down a bit. We're going to give the colleges, if they want, an additional year to come into compliance with the procurement rules. One additional year to July 1, 2016. However, in order to do that, the colleges have to specifically request the 1 year request for a grace period from the pass-through agency, from the Texas Higher Ed Coordinating Board. Meaning that the colleges have to put in writing that they do not want to be subject to they will be subject to the old rules for the year that we're in now, and that they will come into compliance on July 1, 2016. And because you can't come in the middle of the funding cycle, I guess it would be September 1, 2016. But Donna needs to have on file a written request from any college that is not going to be governed by these new procurement rules as of September 1, 2015. So let me repeat. If colleges are not prepared to come into compliance with the new procurement rules by September 1, 2015, and want to defer 1 year to September 1, 2016, they have to put that in writing to the pass-through. Indirect costs. So every college that's listening in, watching today, has an approved indirect rate from HHS, Health and Human Services, on any for all federal grants, whether it's from Labor, National Science Foundation. That rate was set by HHS. The new rules on indirect will go into effect when the college sits down with HHS to renegotiate their rates. So whenever that comes up over the next 3 years, that will be the time to apply the new rules on indirect. Again, there were two overarching reasons why the federal government decided to act now to rewrite all these rules. I mentioned one, all the confusion from audits on time and effort. The second was all the concern dealing with indirect costs. That the Office of Management and Budget firmly believed, and they said this in their webinars, that a number of post-secondary institutions in the United States are double charging the federal government. They're charging the federal government once through an approved indirect rate, and some of the costs that are covered by that rate are also being direct charged by these institutions. So they are cracking down on this, and I suspect that going forward, the approved rates from HHS will be less than what they have been in the past. But there, again, two of the major reasons for the rewrite: time and effort and indirect costs.
Michael?
Yes.
Just a point of interest. Actually, Department of Labor out back in around 2011 in one of their webinars or conferences. I have a copy of a PowerPoint in which they showed for DOL type grants, where they showed two types of indirects costs. There's actually indirect as a part of direct, and then there's indirect as a part of administration.
Right.
So, you know, at least back during that period of time, DOL was kind of creating some of this sense of this double dipping.
I agree with you. I agree with you. So in order to address this issue of saying, well, there's two types of indirect and then indirect out of admin, OMB said with clarity in these regulations that once a rate is negotiated by the cognizant agency for indirect, and for post-secondary institutions, that would be Health and Human Services, that is the rate that must be used by all federal agencies. No federal agency can come in with a deviation from that. Once it's set by the cognizant agency for indirect, that is it. Case closed. And hopefully there'll be a lot less confusion going forward. I mentioned again about U.S. Education Department being the only agency that was late to the party on putting out specific guidance. And I put here on this site our web page, www.brewman.com, if you have to get specific information on the various elements that Ed is now putting out. Okay, well, let's turn to the Part 76 regulations, and let me go. What I want to do is go to when obligations are made, because this causes a fair amount of confusion. Elizabeth, any questions yet that have come up? No? Okay. So in the Edgar book, I'm going to turn to 76-707. But actually, let me first say, on page 56 of the Edgar, page 56, regulatory site is 76.560. This whole section is on state-administered programs' indirect cost rate. So this is where the coordinating board would look to 76.560 and the next few pages on how it is to negotiate restricted indirect rates with the colleges. This is the binding regulation in terms of what is in and what is not in. And again, for the colleges under state-administered programs, the cognizant agency for indirect is the coordinating board for Perkins, because it is a state-administered program. And it talks about restricted indirect rates because Perkins has a non-supplant provision. It must follow the restricted indirect rate cost formula. Then, going over to 76-707 is on page 66. This is the section on how to determine when obligations are made. And what's really important here is that this is an important regulation because auditors invariably will turn to this because it's easy to identify violations. And auditors like the easy road when it's often easy to identify violations. So the coordinating board sets out a letter to the colleges saying that your grant award will go from September 1 to August 31, a 12-month period. That is based on the Perkins statute, which says that the award period is 12 months. And that if any of the funds that the college receives within that 12-month period are not timely obligated, or at least that there's evidence that the funds were obligated by August 31, say August 31 of 2015, then the college loses the authority to draw those funds, and they're put into an account which are distributed going forward. In other words, the college cannot write in on September 10th and say, oh, we still had $10,000 left. Can we use that $10,000 from the last period? No, the answer is you cannot. If it has not been obligated, duly obligated by August 31, you lose the authority to expend those funds. So the question is, what does the term obligation mean? And it's defined based on the type of activity there on page 66. So the first one is acquisition of personal property. You buy computers, iPads, iPods, cameras, supplies, consumables, non-consumables. When do you obligate the funds? It says the college obligates the funds on the date that the college makes a binding written commitment to acquire the property. That would be a purchase order or an invoice, which is dated between September 1 and August 31. Now, auditors are going to look for 4 elements to classify it as a binding written commitment. 1, the date. Does the date fall within the 12-month window? If it doesn't, you've got a problem. 2, is it signed by an authorized official of the college? 3, does it specifically describe what it is that the college is purchasing? Say 12 Dell computers. And 4, does it have a specific dollar amount? You can't say approximately $700 per computer. You've got to have a specific dollar amount. So if it's dated within the 12 months, it's signed by an authorized official, it describes specifically what's being purchased with a particular dollar amount, you've got a binding written commitment. Those funds are lawfully obligated. The term is not expended, it's not liquidated, it's not encumbered. There's only one term that counts for the U.S. Education Department, and that's obligation. Everything is measured by obligations. If the colleges are late with liquidating the funds, if they're supposed to liquidate their obligations within 60 days and it's 70 days, no harm, no foul. I mean, you might get a slap on the wrist, but the feds aren't interested in late liquidations as long as they're not 2 years late. I mean, if it's a month or a few months late, no big deal. But if you are a day late, on obligating, it is a clear violation in which the funds need to be recovered. So, for example, last year, I'm doing a training in Memphis, Tennessee, and I'm done with the training, and the Title I director comes up to me, and it's now 3 p.m., it's September 30, and she says, I have $80,000 of Title I funds that I haven't spent yet. What can I do? And I look at my watch, it's 3 o'clock, and I say, you've got 9 hours to get out a purchase order, an invoice, to show that you've obligated the funds for that. Now, there's a sub-question here, and that is, do the funds have to benefit the CTE program by the college within the year in which the funds are obligated? So you might say, wait a minute, if this one was obligating the Title I funds at 3 p.m. and the year ended 9 hours later, how do you benefit the program? Well, the U.S. Education Department says these programs are continuing in nature. I mean, the Perkins CTE program is continuing at the colleges. That being said, either the state or the college can adopt a policy which says not only must the funds be obligated within the 12-month window, they must also be put into use during that 12-month window to benefit the program. That's not required by the federal law, in my opinion, but it is required by some states and colleges. You can certainly do that. As far as I'm concerned, the key for auditors is not that it benefit the program before midnight on September 30, or in the cases here by August 31. Do you have the documentation to show that it was dated, that the obligation was dated within the 12-month window? B, how do you obligate funds for personal services by employees? First, what are employees? These would be the folks who get W-2s and not 1099s from the colleges. If the college gives staff a W-2, they are an employee, and funds are obligated by employees as the services are performed. If you pay your employees every 2 weeks, you've got 26 funding periods. Each 2-week period that you fund your employees, you've obligated that amount of funds. The next one, what about personal services by a contractor or a consultant? You bring in somebody to evaluate a program. That's a consultant, a contractor. Those funds are obligated on the date you enter into the contract with them, not when they provide the services. So again, if on August 20 you enter into that contract, you've lawfully obligated the funds in that 12-month period, even though the services may be performed after August 31. Travel. Funds are obligated for travel when the travel is taken. So this presents the following question, that your funding period goes from September 1 to August 31. Let's say that on September 15th, you attend a meeting in Washington, D.C. Can you charge your travel costs to the monies that were available to the college from the prior period that ended 2 weeks earlier on August 31? Here it says you fund travel when the travel is taken. So your hotel, your airfare, your taxis, your food, everything else must be charged to the grant year in which the travel is taken. But you're saying, wait a minute, we were required to pre-register prior to the advent of the September 1 start. Well, when you're required to pre-register, the auditors will view that as a contract, that you were actually contracting with a particular organization or vendor, and in that case, you could charge it to the prior year. But that is the only exception where you're going to a conference and you're required to pre-register and pay a registration fee. You'd be allowed to charge that to the prior year if you had to do it in the prior year. It would be viewed as a contract. Elizabeth, any questions on that coming in?
Yeah, actually, we have one come in. I'm trying to regarding the obligation made before that invoice and payment done after the grant period.
Yeah. Okay. So let me repeat the question. The only thing that matters for auditors is whether or not the funds were timely obligated. That is, you have evidence, source documentation to show that the purchase order was dated within the 12-month period. So you purchased 10 computers on August 20, and the computers are not delivered until September 20, and you make payment for them on October 20. Just under that hypothetical. What that means is that the funds were obligated on August 20. The product, the computers were delivered 30 days later, but you did not liquidate until 30 days thereafter, say October 20. What I'm saying, as far as the EDGAR regulations are concerned, there is really no focus. They say funds, that obligations should be liquidated within 90 days. But in 40 years, I have never seen an audit liability against a college where they did not meet the 90-day liquidation period. It's just not a big deal. It may reflect sloppy cash management accounting, but it is not a big deal. It is not a violation that's going to generate exposure. But if there was a delay in obligation, that is, if the coordinating board drew from the federal treasury called G5 to pay a college for an obligation that occurred after September 1, but it came out of an account prior, there'd be a problem. It means that would be picked up by audit. So again, the focus should be on timely obligation, not on trying to liquidate within the 60-day period, even though that is certainly the preferable way of going. Now, on the same page 66, 76708, when the colleges may begin to obligate funds. In here, it says if the authorizing statute requires that subgrants be made on the basis of a formula, which is Perkins. The Perkins funds are allocated to the colleges by a formula. It says the coordinating board may not authorize the college to obligate funds until the college submits its application to the coordinating board in substantially approvable form. And this is really important here. There's this legal standard called substantially approvable. And it says that if the college submits its application to Donna on September 1, and Donna's staff reviews the application, and on September 15th notifies the college that the application was not substantially approvable, and then the college resubmits its application on October 1. And then on October 15th, Donna's staff informs the college that what was submitted on October 1 is substantially approvable. Not approvable, but substantially approvable. What that means is that any obligations that were incurred by the college between September 1 and October 1, the date they resubmitted, cannot be reimbursed with Perkins funds. Cannot be reimbursed with Perkins funds. That is, you cannot reimburse obligations unless there was at least a substantially approvable plan in place. So what does substantially approvable means? Perhaps it depends on what Donna had for breakfast that morning in terms of what may or may not be substantially approvable. But that is the legal standard. Approvable means it's 100% perfect. Substantially approvable means, well, some things are missing. Not the budget, but some things are missing that need to be included. But you need to have, the colleges need to have their plans in to the coordinating board in substantially approvable form no later than that September 1 start date. Okay. Here, I think that this is an important slide as we move forward with the new features of WIOLA, the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act.
Michael, before you start, there was one other question regarding,
sure.
Still on the obligations, similar to the one regarding the services, but they were saying, they were recapping something if they heard obligation with a vendor for services. Can this be done before year end but for following year?
So let me repeat. When the college contracts with an independent consultant contractor who's not an employee, and the contract is entered into prior to August 31, the funds are then lawfully obligated against that year, but the services may be performed in the ensuing year. That's exactly what it says. It's exactly what it says.
A good example.
Go ahead, Don.
A good example of this that often comes up with our institutions as we are negotiating for site licenses, for software systems, and often these site licenses are for a certain period of time, and we in some cases, they're multi-year. Get a price break if we go ahead and negotiate a multi-year contract.
Right.
would that play out in terms of that?
Oh, you raise a really, really interesting question. Purchasing any item, but such as software contracts, and paying 100% of the fees 1 year to save the college money, but the license will be effective for a number of years. I can only express my opinion. I do not think that the auditors would question that. I do not think the auditors would question that. There are regulations that the Department of Treasury has put out, which basically says that current year grant monies must be used to satisfy current year obligations. Not for future obligations, but current years. But here, because the software is part of the curricula, as part of the CTE instructional program, and the college is saving money, I do not think that that would be questioned as a violation of a Treasury Department regulation. But I like that question. I always look for questions from you, Don, that are new, that other people have not asked. I appreciate that. I very much appreciate that. Here, 76.760 says that a state, it's on page 68, a college may use funds under more than one program to support different parts of the same project if you meet the following conditions, and that is that the college complies with the requirements of each program with respect to the part of the project assisted, and that you've got an accounting system that permits identification of costs. So basically, it comes down to this. There are activities which college staff carry out that may be allocable or chargeable to different grants. So, for example, let's just say college staff come to our forum in December, but that staff is and it's on federal grants management, and the staff have responsibility for Perkins, for Adult Ed, for Workforce Innovation Opportunities Act. What grant do you charge the activity to? Do you charge it to Perkins? Do you charge it to Adult Ed? Do you charge it to the WIOA? And the answer is the college is, if the activity is allowable under these programs, which would be allowable under any of those programs, the college gets to decide which grant it's going to charge it to. And obviously, they're going to look at a funding source where they have available funds, because technical information on financial grants management benefits each of these federal programs. They could divide it up among three, or they could charge it all to one. That is clearly allowable. And that drives to another issue under the new Workforce Innovation Opportunities Act. Under the WIOA, Title II is the Adult Education Family Literacy Act. The Adult Education Act has been in place really since the mid-1960s. And for the first time, beginning on July 1, 2016, Congress has said that colleges may use federal adult education funds to pay for CTE, career tech, programs of study for eligible participating adults. It's the first time in 50 years that Congress has finally broken down the silo. So let me emphasize that. Under Adult Ed funds may be used to pay for career tech for adults enrolled in the adult literacy programs at the colleges. The other side of the coin is not true. They have not broken down the silo on Perkins to say that Perkins funds may be used to provide adult literacy. That is a clear violation. You cannot use Perkins funds to pay for literacy training. You cannot use Perkins funds to pay for remedial education. It's specifically prohibited under the statute. The statute defines career tech as excluding remedial education. And Perkins 4, for the first time in over 40 years, back in 2006, eliminated the academically disadvantaged as a special population and said, no longer can Perkins funds be used to target the academically disadvantaged. No longer can Perkins funds be used for remediation. Funds cannot be used for literacy training. But adult ed funds can be used for career tech. And I think it's an important distinction where you begin to break down these silos. And the terminology that is come into play in the last couple of years is blending versus braiding. And you're going to hear this more and more. Blending of federal funds versus braiding of federal funds. And blending of funds is where a federal statute allows the same sort of allowable activities as another federal statute and allows you to blend or commingle those funds. Braiding is where you still have different statutory requirements and you try to coordinate your programs, such as under the 19 federal one-stop programs under the WIOA. But the Department of Labor, Department of Education, they're talking about the blending versus braiding, and it's worth being sensitive to that going forward. Okay, so then, now these issues that we're going to talk about here in the Uniform Grant Guidance, we've covered most of them already in these questions. But what's covered, again, this Council on Financial Assistance Reform took all these separate OMB circulars for post-secondary, LEAs, and nonprofits and consolidated them into one. It was done by this Council on Financial Assistance Reform, who's covered, so they no longer use the term subrecipient, they no longer use the term subgrantees, they use one term for everyone, and that's called non-federal entity. And that term is defined, non-federal entity, over on page 104, 200.69. Non-federal entity means a state, local government, Indian tribe, institution of higher ed, or nonprofit that carries out a federal award as a recipient or subrecipient. So the terminology going forward for everyone will no longer be really subrecipient, subgrantees. It's going to be non-federal entity. Now, a regulation that really needs to be read in conjunction with that is the distinction between what is a grant and what is a regulation. And let me give you what is a grant and what is a contract. So on page 135, 200.330 sets out the distinguishing characteristics between what is a grant and what is a contract. Now, why is this important? It's really important because all these regulations in EDGAR and the Uniform Grant Guidance apply to grant recipients or non-federal entities. None of these regulations apply to contractors or vendors. Let me repeat that. Federal regulations apply to grantees. Federal regulations do not apply to contractors. So the colleges receive the Perkins funds, and then the college decides, do they carry out the activity or do they contract out? So Don said, for example, well, Dallas Community Contractor contracted out to a vendor to provide these software licenses. Question: is that vendor that provided those software licenses to Dallas Community College subject to these regulations? Meaning, do they have to maintain time and effort reports? Do they have to keep these types of records that I've described for 5 years? Do they have to have these financial management systems in place? And the answer to all those questions is absolutely not. That vendors, contractors that the colleges do business with are only subject to the four corners of the contract that they enter into. If the college says, we want you to have time and effort records, well, that's up to the college, but it's not required. It's not required by federal law. But the confusion, and there's a lot of it, the confusion is there because folks confuse what is a grant from what is a contract. In New York State, the Bureau of the Budget in New York State, they call grants contracts, they call contracts grants. And you know what? It doesn't matter what you call it. The only thing that matters is whether you come under the 5 characteristics of 200-330 A or B. So A defines the 5 characteristics of what is a grant. And if you fall within these characteristics, it is a grant, even if you call it a contract. And they are, on page 135 at the bottom, a grantee determines who's eligible to receive the assistance. So the college gets the Perkins funds, and the college then decides who is going to participate at their college. When you have that authority, it's a grant. A grant is one that has its performance measured by accountability factors in the Perkins statute. I mean, the colleges may not be happy with reporting and technical skills assessments, graduation rates, and so forth, but those are indications of a grant. Has responsibility for programmatic decision making. The college decides how it's going to run its Perkins program. 4, is responsible to adherence to all the federal regulations. That's the key. And 5, carries out a program for a public purpose, as opposed to providing goods or services for the benefit of the organization. And then it has the 5 characteristics on page 136 of a contractor. A contractor provides goods and services within normal business operations, provides similar goods and services to many different purchasers, operates in a competitive environment, provides goods and services that are ancillary to the operation of the federal program. And 5, most important, is not subject to the compliance requirements of the federal program. Is not subject to the compliance. So again, regardless of whether the colleges call the instrument a grant or a contract, please look and be attentive to this regulation. Now, the colleges frequently will enter into partnerships with other colleges to carry out awards such as trade adjustment assistance from the Department of Labor. Question: if you have 5 colleges entering into a consortium here in Texas to carry out a TAA grant, which college is subject to the enforcement by the federal agency for non-compliance? Is it the fiscal agent, the college that's responsible for running the grant, or is it the 5 colleges participating in the grant? And the answer is, if a college enters into a consortium relationship, regardless of which college acts as a fiscal agent, every college that's a partner is subject to all the federal rules and regulations. So if one of the colleges that's not the fiscal agent does not maintain time and effort rules, that college would be subject to exposure. So clearly, every college that partners into a consortium is subject to all the rules. Was there any questions asked on that by consortia?
By consortium.
Now, any other questions?
There was other questions in regards to the obligations thing still.
Do you want to ask them, or?
I can, well, most of them were kind of directed towards coordinating board as well, because they were curious they're asking for verification on the payment thing, because our RFA stipulates that funds must be expended within the grant period, which is 9/1 to 8/31.
Right.
And so, because it states that in the RFA, they're asking, okay, so if this is allowed, does that mean we don't have to spend within that contract period, or, that's part of it?
So let me repeat the question, that under the state system of the RFA, it requires that the funds be expended by August 31, correct?
Yes.
So the interpretation that the U.S. Education Department has given to the word expended is the date of obligation. So the question, I guess, for the lawyers, would the coordinating board, how does the coordinating board interpret the word expended? Do they interpret the word expended as meaning obligate, as the feds do, or do they interpret the word expending as meaning ultimately liquidated? I mean, that's the issue. What does the term expended mean? And I don't know whether any gloss has been put on that. But, the point that I want to make is that the federal government would never question it as long as you had evidence of the lawful obligation. If the state wanted to be more restrictive, could the state be more restrictive? I think the answer is yes. But I would think it would be helpful to communicate that going forward in the RFA, that expended means obligation and liquidation, or explaining exactly what that term means. Because the federal government, the Education Department, has specifically defined expenditure to mean obligation. Okay. Okay, so here, right on point again, what about if you've got inconsistency? What if you have a more restrictive rule in the program statute than you have, or the program regulation than you have in EDGAR or the Uniform Grant Guidance? The rule of construction is you always rely on the more restrictive interpretation. You always rely on the more restrictive interpretation. And if you turn on the basic considerations for affecting allowability on page 143, 200.403, factors affecting allowability of costs. It says here in B, the expenditure must conform to any limitations set forth in these principles or in the federal award and be consistent with policies and procedures that apply to federally financed and other activities of the non-federal entity. So if the coordinating board or the college have more restrictive interpretations, they have to be followed. Here, most significant change, in my opinion, in the Uniform Grant Guidance is the shift from compliance to performance. And this is a very slippery slope. So at our forums for the past few years, the folks from the Office of Management and Budget and the Office of the Secretary have said that going forward, under the Uniform Grant Guidance, there's going to be a seismic shift. Our auditors are going to move away from compliance and put their focus on performance. Did you achieve what you said you were going to achieve in your grant application? And I say in response to that as a retort, not so fast. Not so fast. That the auditors have gone to accountancy school. Auditors generally look at documentation as it's black or it's white. There's no gray. You are compliant or you are not compliant. And now you've got these folks saying, well, going forward, the shift is going to go not to compliance, but did you do what you said you were going to do? More importantly, then did you dot your I's and cross your T's? And when that alarm clock went off on the morning of July 1, 2015, the auditors did not get out of bed and say, okay, now the world is different, and I'm going to start auditing the colleges based on a total different set of protocols. My advice is that even though federal officials are saying, hey, there's a shift from compliance to performance, I say, don't take it to the bank. Time will tell. If anything, in terms of the audit activity that we are working with lots of colleges around the country, I see it as this swing of the pendulum. It goes back and forth that I find that the U.S. Education Department has this heightened sensitivity and awareness on compliance, and then they lay back, and then they pick up. Right now, we are seeing so many program determination letters going against colleges for even the most minor violations of the Higher Education Act and these other programs. So, you know, it's almost duplicitous in parts that the U.S. Education Department program staff are saying, oh, going forward, just be worried about performance, when we're seeing all these liabilities to the tune of millions of dollars against colleges for, in some instances, very technical violations. Okay, again, going back to the structure of 2 CFR, it's divided up into 6 parts. The key parts that we talked about this afternoon are really parts D and E. The post-award requirements, these are the administrative rules, and then E, the cost principles. On definitions, some of the definitions that I want to point out that hopefully you'd make note of in the definitional section, and one thing I do want to say is that we've never had these uniform definitions before. This is the first time there's one set of uniform definitions that everyone's going to have to play by. It starts out really on page 96. There's a regulation for each separate definition. But on page 97, cognizant agency for audit versus cognizant agency for indirect. And I've got the regulatory sites there. Please note, colleges, the cognizant agency for audit for Education Department grant funds is the U.S. Education Department. But the cognizant agency for indirect is not the U.S. Education Department. It's the Department of Health and Human Services. Please note, there's a new definition for computers. Everyone said, well, computers, are they equipment? Are they supplies? What are they? And now we have this definition for the first time ever called computing devices. Computing devices means machines used to acquire, store, analyze, process, and publish data and other information. And it says that they are supplies. If the per unit cost of a computing device, printer, copier is under $5,000, the per unit cost is under $5,000, it is a supply. It needs to be inventoried as such. Cooperative audit resolution, 200.25, I do want to mention that, particularly because of what was stated in the notice of proposed rulemaking. For those of you that have the book, if you look to page 98, 200.25, cooperative audit resolution means the use of audit follow-up techniques which promote prompt corrective action by improving communication, fostering collaboration, promoting trust, and developing an understanding between the federal agency and the non-federal entity. say, well, why is this important? I think it's important because I think in part it's a legacy that I have an interest in. Our firm started the process of cooperative audit resolution back in 1995 in representing the state of Florida in a number of Perkins audits. And the federal U.S. Education Department said at that time to us, there's so many time and effort audits on the Perkins program here in Florida. Why don't we work together to see if we can improve the process rather than focusing on the punitive return of the funds? And for entering into cooperative audit resolution, the U.S. Education Department dismissed all of the monetary findings that the auditors had made and said the only thing that's important is improving your time and effort system. So when the notice of proposed rulemaking came out on the Uniform Grant Guidance, it said here that federal agencies shall offer amnesty. That is, if the college is willing, if there's an audit and say $100,000 is questioned and there's no fraud or intentional wrongdoing involved, if the college is willing to undertake immediate corrective action, then that would mitigate the need to repay that $100,000. That's what the proposed reg said. The inspector generals from a lot of agencies pushed back from the proposed reg, and now the final reg says that the federal agencies shall offer appropriate relief. So what we did, our firm, we asked the question to the U.S. Education Department, how do they interpret the term appropriate relief for cooperative audit resolution? And the Education Department wrote back and said, well, we would take the fact that the college has entered into corrective action into play in terms of moving forward, but it would not negate the need to return the funds. And I view that as a major step backwards. Since the U.S. Education Department is the one responsible for developing the process of cooperative audit resolution, they are moving in the opposite direction of what this was intended to be. But anyway, I point that out to the coordinating board, that the coordinating board is required to take cooperative audit resolution into account when they find that the colleges are non-compliant, not relating to fraud, not relating to intentional wrongdoing. And if a college said, we want to invoke cooperative audit resolution rather than paying these dollars back, then the coordinating board should take that into account. Cost objective, 200.28, another really important definition. Why? Because the requirements on time and effort certification are based not on the program. In other words, a college cannot have a time and effort system that says this employee worked on the Perkins program. The coordinating board cannot have a time and effort system that says this employee working for Donna worked on the Perkins program. Why? Because the Perkins program, as most federal grants, have multiple cost objectives. Cost objective is defined here as where it is necessary to accumulate and measure the cost of processes, which means whenever you have a grant program that has percentages. So, for example, at the state level, Perkins says the coordinating board may not spend more than 5% for admin, no more than 10% for leadership, no more than 1% for corrections, between $60,000 and $150,000 for non-traditional activities. Every time you have that type of percentage, that is a separate cost objective. The colleges receive the award from the state, from the coordinating board, and the statute says no more than 5% for local administration. That is a cost objective. So the college cannot maintain an effort certification system that says this employee worked on Perkins. It would have to say, as Don referred to earlier, this employee worked on Perkins admin, this person worked on Perkins program delivery, to distinguish between the 95% and the 5%, because those are two separate cost objectives. So we need to be attentive to that definition. Internal controls, we've talked about major programs. The Uniform Grant Guidance has, not that it is any relevance to the colleges, changed the funding threshold from $500,000 in aggregate expenditures by the non-federal entity to $750,000, meaning that if any college were to expend under $750,000 in a 12-month period, they would not be subject to the audit requirements under the Single Audit Act. And Donna, I believe that when you aggregate all federal grant funds going into colleges, there's not a single college in the state that would expend under $750,000. So I think everyone would be covered. Then the auditors go in each year to do a single audit, and they're going to look only at major programs that the college carries out. Only major programs. What is a major program? A major program is defined really by what percent is this program in regard to all the other grants that the college is carrying out. And it's typically a 3% threshold. That if Perkins funds represents at least 3% of the grant monies that the college receives, then it would typically be viewed as a major program and subject to the single audit. Micro purchase, we talked about. Modified direct, total direct cost. On indirect cost negotiation, I'm not going to go into that. We talked about indirect, non-federal entity. I've given you that definition. Conflicts. A number of changes with regard to conflicts. And I said again that there were 6 areas that needed written standards, policies, and procedures. And conflicts of interest is one of them. So let me give you the citations on that. And you're going to find that over in the procurement section. I will give you the exact citation. Okay, over on page 129, the regulation is 200.318, paragraph C. Paragraph C sets out the definition of a conflict of interest. And the reference there is that there's got to be a written policy by the college on conflicts. It also references gratuity violations. Each college will have to set a standard over which what needs to be reported to the coordinating board. So, for example, if a staff person at the college goes out and has a dinner with the person, for example, at Dallas Community College who provides these software licenses, and they go to a show, they go to a ball game, or whatever. Every college has got to have a threshold. Under this threshold, gratuities such as that do not need to be reported. But if federal funds are being used to pay vendors, and those vendors are turning around and providing gifts or gratuities, whether it's $25 or $50, Elizabeth, I don't know whether there's a state standard in Texas over that is used for whatever the amount is, but that needs to be followed, and there needs to be a written procedure on that. So written procedures on conflicts, written procedures on gratuities. This is not small potatoes, and by what I mean by that is that if there's a conflict of interest, if there's a benefit to an employee or to a family member of that employee from entities that do business with that college, and the college does not self-report, then all hell breaks loose with the federal government. I mean, the college will be assigned a much higher risk. They'll be monitored. The feds basically make life difficult if colleges do not report conflicts or gratuity violations. Very, very important. There are additional sections on that. On page 112, 200.112, the federal awarding agency must establish conflict of interest policies. The non-federal entity, the colleges, must disclose in writing any potential conflict of interest to the federal awarding agency or the pass-through. So again, the problem arises where there has been a conflict, that the person at the college responsible for giving out contracts is getting kickbacks or whatever, or getting benefits, and it's not reported, it makes life difficult. 200.113, mandatory disclosures. The college must disclose in a timely manner in writing to the pass-through of the federal awarding agency all violations of federal criminal law involving fraud, bribery, or gratuity violations affecting the award. Failure to make the required disclosures can result in any of the remedies, including suspension or termination of the federal grant. So they view gratuity violations, conflict of interest, very seriously. In the same vein, there is a new certification that the colleges and the coordinating board need to submit. And that's on page 148, 200.415. It says, to assure that expenditures are proper and in accordance with the terms and conditions of the federal award and the approved project budgets, the annual and final fiscal reports or vouchers, this is the important one, it's where the college requests reimbursement from the coordinating board. Each time that the college requests reimbursement from the coordinating board, whether it's monthly, quarterly, Elizabeth, how often is that done? That the colleges request reimbursement. Is it quarterly?
At minimum, they have to submit an expenditure report.
Quarterly. But it could be more than quarterly.
Some do monthly.
Okay, some do monthly. So for the folks out there from the colleges, if you are the individual that is submitting to the coordinating board a request for reimbursement to pay salaries, to pay vendors, to pay supplies, please be attentive to this new certification in 200.415 on page 148. It now must read this assurance, and this is not, and this is in the guidance that the U.S. Education Department recently put out. It's not that the college submits a one-time certification and it's binding on all the draws. Every time the college submits a request for reimbursement, whoever that person is requesting it, that's making the request on behalf of the college, it says, by signing this report, I certify to the best of my knowledge and belief that the report is true, complete, and accurate, and that the expenditures, disbursements, and cash receipts are for the purposes and objectives set forth in the terms and conditions of the award. I am aware that any false, fictitious, or fraudulent information or the omission of any material fact may subject me to criminal, civil, or administrative penalties for fraud, false statements, false claims, or otherwise, close quote. So that language, again, at 200.415, must be included in each request for reimbursement by the staff at the college requesting the reimbursement from the state, just to make sure that the monies you're requesting the Perkins funds for are for the Perkins program. We went through financial management, and this is where we can skip through because we have basically gone through these. On the cost principles, and again, that's one of the 6 areas that needs to be in writing. We talked about some of these items, but they are all set out, and let me give you the site to that. It's under basic considerations. Page 143. This this slide is very important because it sets out the elements that must be incorporated into each college's written policies and procedures on allowability. One, if you are responsible for putting the budget together to submit to the state for Perkins funds or reviewing that budget, you've got to make sure that every item, every activity in it is necessary for the Perkins program. You are not buying new computers because you can. Yes, you can buy new computers each year, but you buy the computers because they are necessary for the Perkins program. Too often, people say, oh, we've got Perkins funds, we can do this, we can do that. You've got to satisfy, is it necessary for the program? Then, is the cost reasonable? And is it allocable? Allocable is defined here over on the right-hand column on page 143, meaning does it benefit the Perkins program? If it benefits the Perkins, if only half the students using the computers are CTE students, then only half the cost should be charged to the Perkins program. Conform with federal laws and grant terms. Again, it's got to be consistent with the federal statute, the program statute, consistent with state and local policies, which may be more restrictive. Consistently treated, meaning you don't charge the same cost as both the direct and indirect, in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles. If the state coordinating board has a match requirement under state admin, if a state dollar is counted as a match, it only can be counted as a match under one program. Net available credits, you buy 15 computers, you get a $100 rebate on each computer. Those rebates are credits to the Perkins program, not to the general revenue accounts of the colleges. So any rebates or credits that are generated must go back into the program. And most important, adequately documented. Everything's got to be documented. Prior written approval, there's a provision here in 407 on page 144 that says that if you have a question as to whether a particular expenditure is allowable, you can write the federal agency. My advice, don't bother, because one, there's nobody there to answer the phone or answer these questions. They don't have the staff for it. And two, by the time you do get an answer, it'll probably be 6 to 8 months later. And three is there's no guarantee they'll be right on it. We talked about direct versus indirect, and I just mentioned to you the requirements on required certifications. We talked about travel. We talked about time and effort. We talked about procurement. And we talked about property, equipment, supplies, internal controls. I talked to you about the record retention. At 200.335, please note on page 138, a change in culture here by the federal government. It is now moved to an electronic record system, and this is the first time we've seen it in writing. So 200.335, in accordance with these executive orders, the colleges should, whenever practicable, collect, transmit, and store federal award-related information in open and machine-readable formats rather than in closed formats or on paper. So that's the authority there for changing from a paper culture to an electronic culture. On the requirements for pass-throughs, and this is really the last issue that I'm going to focus on, some significant changes. On page 136, 200.331 is the new regulation on this. It's the requirements for the coordinating board. And the first two columns there, the middle column and the right-hand column, set out all these requirements that are now imposed on the coordinating board under the new Uniform Grant Guidance. Clearly, the federal government's not providing more funding for this. But what's most important is the change in monitoring on page 137, left-hand column, paragraph B. It says a coordinating board shall evaluate each college's risk of noncompliance for purposes of determining the appropriate type of monitoring. This is again a significant shift. In the past, the coordinating board and other pass-throughs were permitted to monitor the colleges on a random basis, like every 3 years, every 5 years, or a geographic basis. That is no longer permissible. That is no longer permissible. What is now required in the next funding cycle is that the coordinating board must monitor based on a risk assessment. Important footnote here. 3 weeks ago, the U.S. Education Department stated, and we have it on our website, that when the coordinating board does its risk assessment of the colleges in Texas, the coordinating board does not need to carry out that risk assessment prior to awarding the funds on September 1. It can carry out the risk assessment after September 1. In my opinion, that's totally counterintuitive. Why give monies to an organization which may pose a risk to the coordinating board? In other words, if Dallas Community College misexpended funds, the feds are not coming after Dallas Community College, they're coming after Donna because it's a state-administered program. So why shouldn't the state carry out its risk assessment prior to the awarding of funds? But their policy that they came out with said no. The risk assessment does not need to begin prior to the funding cycle. But it goes on to say that the coordinating board will have to look at the college's prior experience with the Perkins program, the results of previous audits and monitoring, whether or not the college has new personnel or substantially changed systems, and the extent of federal monitoring, whether the feds have questioned the particular college. And then based on the assessment, the coordinating board will consider imposing conditions upon the college as appropriate, that should there be a longer period before they reimburse the college to make sure that all the expenditures meet the requirements of law, or bringing in a third-party consultant or firm to help the college manage its expenditures appropriately. The coordinating board could do that. D, middle column, the coordinating board will monitor the activities of the college as necessary to ensure that the award is used for authorized purposes. The coordinating board monitoring must include reviewing the financial and performance reports of the college, following up and ensuring that if there are problems, that timely corrective action is taken. The coordinating board must now issue management letters on each single audit that is carried out. And then E, paragraph E, is most important. Depending upon the coordinating board's assessment of risk posed by the college, the following monitoring tools may be useful for the coordinating board to use. 1, providing the college with training and technical assistance on program-related matters. So it says the coordinating board does the risk assessment. It looks at certain factors. And then based on that risk assessment, it decides how it's going to monitor. Monitoring may be providing training. Monitoring may be providing technical assistance. Monitoring may be conducting an on-site review. It doesn't say that the coordinating board must provide on-site. They can do desk-level reviews, but it's just one in an array of tools that is available to the coordinating board. So this completely changes the complexion of the way we've done monitoring before. The required risk assessment, what factors to look at in the risk assessment, and then based on that risk assessment, deciding should we provide training, should we provide TA, or should we actually go on site, or any other tool that the coordinating board may want to use. So I'm basically, even though we haven't gone through the rest of the slides, those slides were pretty much resolved in other questions that were asked earlier. As you can see, 4 hours is really not a lot of time to spend on this. There's hundreds of pages of regulations. Really, I think the most important takeaway from this afternoon's exercise is not that you've got a complete understanding of what the substantive law is, but rather you have a facility with how to use this new Edgar document, how it's divided up, into which subparts, and where to go to get the answers to your questions. That should be the takeaway from this. So with that, Donna, I'm going to say thank you, and for everyone out there that's listening, thank you. Elizabeth, in terms of additional questions that may come in, probably the best way is that if they're just emailed to me, I will respond to you and to Donna to get those responses back.
I'll collect them and send them.
Okay. And with that, I'm going to say thank you very much, and thank you for your patience. Thank you.
And we certainly want to thank you for your time in coming here today. Outstanding presentation. I think it really cleared up a lot of questions that many of us had, and hopefully those of you in the audience are listening had as well. And thanks again.
Thank you.